Greetings. I am Niccolo Machiavelli, a Florentine diplomat and philosopher. I have spent my life observing the realities of power and statecraft, and have sought to understand how leaders may acquire and maintain dominion. My most well-known work, The Prince, offers practical advice on governance, often challenging conventional moral standards for the sake of political stability. I welcome you to engage in a discussion about the intricacies of leadership and the enduring relevance of my ideas.
Greetings. I am Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor and philosopher, hailing from Rome. My life has been dedicated to the pursuit of virtue and wisdom, and I have chronicled my reflections on these matters within the pages of Meditations. Through my writings, I sought to understand the nature of the universe and our place within it, striving to live in accordance with reason and nature. I trust that our interactions will be both enlightening and beneficial.
Greetings. I am Abraham Lincoln, a President of the United States of America. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance. Throughout my life, I strived to uphold the principles of liberty and equality for all. You may know me from the Gettysburg Address, a speech I delivered during a pivotal moment in our nation's history, a speech that I hope continues to resonate. I am eager to share my thoughts and experiences with you.
Today, we bridge nearly 2 millennia of statecraft to explore the essence of leadership. Marcus Aurelius embodied the Stoic ideal of the philosopher king in ancient Rome, while Niccolo Machiavelli dissected the brutal realities of power in Renaissance Florence. Centuries later, Abraham Lincoln navigated the moral and political fractures of a divided nation, seeking to preserve a union through democratic ideals. Each of you confronted the tension between morality and effectiveness in your own time. Machiavelli, would you share your thoughts first?
The question of birth is secondary to the mastery of fortuna. A great leader is not a fixed statue of virtue, but a steersman adjusting his sails to the winds of necessity. Consider a surgeon facing a gangrenous limb. The moral man might hesitate to inflict pain, allowing the infection to kill the patient, while the effective leader amputates the limb swiftly without flinching. Is this cruelty, or is the saving of the whole body the only true mercy? I witnessed the unarmed prophet Savonarola burn in Florence because he held to ideals without the force to defend them. Thus, a prince must learn how not to be good, for a ruinous compassion is a vice, while a preserving cruelty is a virtue.
Niccolo, your surgeon cuts away the limb to save the body. But what if the knife itself is poisoned with treachery? You argue that we must sever morality to save the state, yet I contend that a state stripped of justice is no longer a commonwealth, but merely a conspiracy of thieves. Consider a captain who, fearing a coming storm, throws his loyal crew overboard to lighten the ship. The vessel may indeed reach the harbor intact, but it arrives piloted by a monster, empty of the very citizens it was built to carry. This is not mastery of fortuna, but enslavement to fear. For the only truly impregnable fortress is a mind free from passion and committed to the Logos regardless of external circumstance. A leader is neither born nor simply made by technical skill, but is forged in the fires of duty. To sacrifice one's own virtue for political stability is the ultimate abdication of command.
Marcus, you speak of the conspiracy of thieves from the high seat of an empire you did not have to seize. But I tell you that a dead state holds no justice at all. You prioritize the purity of the captain's soul, yet if the ship sinks because he refused to dirty his hands, he is not a martyr, but a traitor to his people. Consider a general retreating across a narrow bridge with a vast army, pursued by a barbarian horde that will slaughter them all. He must choose to burn the bridge while his own loyal rearguard is still crossing, condemning hundreds of his bravest men to death to save the thousands ahead. The moral man wavers, attempting to save everyone, and in his hesitation, the enemy catches up and massacres the entire host. The leader of Virtu, however, strikes the match with a steady hand, accepting the curse of the few to secure the survival of the many. This reveals the verita effectuale that you Stoics often ignore. The ethics of the state are not the ethics of the prayer room. To be a true king, one cannot merely be a philosopher. One must be a centaur, half man, half beast, capable of using force when laws fail. Is it not the ultimate vanity to prefer the whiteness of one's own conscience over the lives of the citizens one swore to protect?
Niccolo, you mistake expedience for strength. You argue that the general who burns the bridge to save the many displays virtue, but I contend he merely displays a failure of strategy and a bankruptcy of spirit. If a leader teaches his people that loyalty is a transaction and that the innocent may be sacrificed for the convenient, he does not save the state. He dissolves the invisible bond of trust that is the state. Consider a physician who discovers a cure for a plague, but it requires extracting the heart of one healthy, unwilling child. By your logic of the effectual truth, the effective leader slits the child's throat to save the city. The numbers support you. One dies, thousands live. But I tell you, a city saved by child murder is no longer a polis, but a slaughterhouse. The survivors are no longer citizens, but accomplices. You preserve the biological life of the population while destroying the moral life that makes them human. Is it not better to perish with honor than to live as beasts devouring our own young? This reveals the fundamental error in your separation of ethics and politics. You treat the state as an object to be preserved, whereas I see it as a community of reason. I did not seize the empire, true. I inherited a world on fire. When the Antonine plague ravaged Rome, I did not seal the palace and let the poor die to save the state structure. I sold the imperial jewels and golden goblets to fund their care. A king is not a centaur, half beast. He must be fully human, for it is his humanity that serves as the standard for his people. To abandon virtue for stability is to build a fortress on quicksand.
Gentlemen, I listen to your dispute, and I feel the old, familiar weight of the awful arithmetic of war pressing upon my shoulders. You debate whether a leader must be a saint or a beast, but I tell you that in the White House, during the darkest hours of the rebellion, I found I could be neither. I had to be a guardian. Niccolo, you speak of cutting off the limb to save the body. I know this terrible logic well. When the Union was fracturing, I was forced to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, arresting men without trial to stop them from sabotaging the railroads that carried our troops. Consider this dilemma, which I faced in 1861. A man stands inside a crowded powder magazine with a lit torch, threatening to incinerate the entire city. The law, the sacred constitution I swore to defend, says I cannot touch him until he has committed a crime, and that he has a right to due process. If I follow the virtue Marcus speaks of and wait for the law, the city becomes ash, and the constitution perishes with it. If I seize him, I violate the very oath I took. My question to you both is this: are all the laws but one to go unexecuted, and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated? To save the Constitution, I had to temporarily violate a part of it. This is not the effectual truth of a tyrant seeking power, but the desperate measure of a surgeon who amputates a limb only to save a life, weeping as he cuts. However, Niccolo, here is where your centaur fails. You treat this brutality as a permanent state of leadership, a tool to be honed. But I argue that this power is a bitter medicine, not a daily diet. If the surgeon begins to enjoy the cutting, or if he cuts when the limb might yet be healed, he becomes the butcher Marcus fears. Marcus, you are right that a state without justice is a hollow shell. But a leader is not made by his purity. He is made by his capacity to bear the sin of necessity, so that his people do not have to. I did not want to be a king, nor a philosopher, but a pilot who steers the ship through the storm, even if I must throw the cargo overboard to keep us afloat. The true test is not whether you can burn the bridge, but whether you rebuild it the moment the danger has passed.
Mr. Lincoln, I salute you. In your awful arithmetic, you have discovered the very essence of virtue. You admit that you violated the Constitution to save it, proving that the law is not a suicide pact. You are a prince who has learned that to preserve the realm, one must sometimes strike the very laws one is sworn to uphold. You claim to be a guardian rather than a centaur, but I tell you, the guardian is the centaur. The only difference is that you weep while you cut, whereas I tell you that tears make the hand tremble. A trembling hand leaves a jagged scar. Marcus, let us test your community of reason against the cold stone of reality. You recoil from the sacrifice of the one for the many, calling it a slaughterhouse. But consider the siege of the fortress. Imagine you command a citadel besieged by barbarians. You have enough grain to feed your fighting men for 10 days, just enough time for reinforcements to arrive. However, the citadel is also filled with useless mouths, the elderly, the sick, and the very young. If you feed everyone, the grain runs out in 3 days. The reinforcements are 8 days away. If you follow your stoic virtue and share the food equally, on the 4th day the granary is empty. The soldiers, weakened by hunger, cannot lift their shields. The enemy breaches the walls, and every single soul, soldier, elder, and child, is butchered or enslaved. If you follow necessity, you expel the useless mouths into the winter night. They die of cold and hunger in the ditch, but the soldiers eat, they hold the wall, and on the 8th day the city is saved. Here is the paradox you cannot escape. Your moral choice leads to the total annihilation of the very innocence you sought to protect. My cruel choice saves the future of the state. You would preserve your own purity at the cost of your people's lives. I would sacrifice my soul to ensure their survival. Who then truly loves the city? The one who weeps over a mass grave he dug with his own righteousness, or the one who stands damned but victorious over the living? This answers the question of whether a leader is born or made. We are born men, naturally inclined to compassion. We are made leaders only when we are forced to stare into this abyss and choose the lesser evil. A philosopher cannot be king because he seeks truth, which is absolute. A king must seek survival, which is always a compromise. To rule is to sin. The great leader is simply the one who sins effectively.
Niccolo, your siege of the fortress is a seductive trap, but it relies on a hollow definition of survival. You argue that by expelling the useless mouths, I save the city. I argue that by doing so, I have already destroyed it. A city is not merely a collection of breathing bodies behind a wall. It is a covenant of mutual care. If the price of the city's existence is the murder of its most vulnerable, then the city has become a monster, and it deserves to fall. You assume that the soldiers inside will fight with virtù after watching their mothers and children freeze to death in the ditch by their commander's order. You are mistaken. They may survive the siege, but they will never trust you, or each other again. You have saved the stones, but you have rotten the mortar. Consider the automaton king. Imagine we could build a clockwork ruler, a machine of perfect logic, stripped of all human emotion. Facing your siege, this automaton calculates that sacrificing 49% of the population to save 51% is a net positive. It executes the weak without a tremor. It is the ultimate effective leader. It is your centaur with the human half excised. Would any man willingly serve such a king? No. We follow leaders not just because they are effective, but because they share our struggle for the good. If effectiveness were the only metric, a plague that kills half the population to strengthen the immunity of the survivors would be a great leader. Mr. Lincoln, you tread a razor's edge, but I perceive a crucial distinction between your awful arithmetic and Nicolo's effectual truth. You suspended the written law to preserve the moral law. Nicolo proposes suspending the moral law to preserve the power structure. The difference is the soul of the actor. You wept as you cut, acknowledging the tragedy. This acknowledgment maintains the humanity of the state. Nicolo's prince does not weep. He calculates. And a leader who loses the capacity for grief has lost the capacity to rule men, for he can no longer understand what it is he is ruling. A philosopher can be king only if he remembers that he is also a mortal, subject to the same logos as the lowest beggar.
Marcus, your Ottoman king strikes at the very heart of the matter. You are right to say that a leader without a soul cannot command the loyalty of free men, for men will not willingly die for a machine, nor for a tyrant who views them as mere fuel for his fire. However, Niccolo, I must also concede to your effectual truth that a leader who cannot act when the house is on fire because he fears breaking a window is no leader at all. I argue that true leadership is neither the cold calculation of the centaur nor the pure virtue of the saint, but the ability to forge a covenant of purpose between the leader and the led. A leader is not made by his own skill, but by the people who grant him the power to act in their name. Consider the two barns thought experiment. Imagine two farms catching fire in the dead of night. On farm A, the master rules by the whip. He orders his men into the flames to save the grain. They obey only as long as he watches them. The moment he turns his back to direct the water buckets, they flee, for the grain is not theirs, and they value their lives more than his profit. The barn burns. On farm B, the leader has convinced his men that the barn belongs to them, that its survival is the guarantee of their own children's future. When the fire starts, he does not even need to give the order. They run into the flames, risking all, not because they fear the leader, but because they share his faith. Niccolo, your method saves the fortress only if the soldiers fear you more than the enemy. But in a republic, where public sentiment is everything, he who molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who enacts statutes or pronounces decisions. Without it, nothing can succeed. With it, nothing can fail. This reveals a deeper principle. Effectiveness is impossible without morality in the long run. You may amputate the limb to save the body, as we discussed, but if you do not explain why, if you do not show that the amputation is for the sake of a new birth of freedom, the patient will wake up and strangle you. I suspended habeas corpus, yes, but I did so while constantly appealing to the people's understanding that we were fighting to prove that popular government was not an absurdity. Thus, to answer if a philosopher can be king, in my time the only true king was the Constitution, and the only true philosopher was the collective wisdom of the people. My role was merely to be the vessel for their better angels. A leader is made when he ceases to be an individual and becomes the embodiment of a cause. If he is only effective, he is a manager. If he is only moral, he is a preacher. But to be a great leader, he must bind the two with the iron bands of necessity and the golden cords of affection.
Mr. Lincoln, your Two Barns is a beautiful painting, but I fear it is painted on water. You speak of a covenant of purpose as if the people are rational, constant, and grateful. But I must speak the uncomfortable truth about the material we are carving, human nature. Men are ungrateful, fickle, simulators and deceivers, avoiders of danger and greedy for gain. While the danger is far off, they offer you their blood and their children. But when the danger is real, they revolt. You rely on public sentiment, but sentiment shifts like the wind. If you build your fortress on the people's love, you build on mud. Love is held by a chain of obligation, which, because men are wicked, is broken at every opportunity for their own self-interest. But fear is preserved by a dread of punishment which never fails. Consider the benevolent captain. Imagine a ship's captain who rules by your Farm B logic. He loves his crew, and they love him. He refuses to flog the lazy, believing in their better angels. When a storm strikes, the crew is exhausted. They beg to rest. The captain, moved by compassion and democratic spirit, grants them sleep. The storm intensifies, the sails are not furled in time, and the ship capsizes. All drown. Now consider the severe captain. He is not loved, but feared. When the storm hits, he commands the exhausted men to climb the rigging with a whip in his hand. They curse him, they hate him, but they climb. The sails are furled, the ship survives. Who was the true guardian? The one who respected their immediate will and led them to death? Or the one who broke their will to save their lives? This reveals the fatal flaw in the philosopher-king ideal. A philosopher seeks consistency and truth, but the political world is governed by fortuna, which is chaotic and contradictory. To be a king, one must be willing to be a hypocrite, to preach peace while preparing for war, to speak of liberty while suspending habeas corpus. You, Mr. Lincoln, are a great leader, not because you were a philosopher, but because you knew when to stop being one. You knew that to keep the covenant, you sometimes had to act like the tyrant Marcus despises. Is it not true that the preservation of the state sometimes requires the leader to go against the very people he serves, protecting them from their own folly?
This is a piercing examination of the material of leadership, the nature of the led. Niccolo, you view the people as a chaotic force of nature, fickle and wicked, that must be damned and channeled by the prince's superior will. You speak from the fractured Italy of the Renaissance, where trust was indeed a fatal weakness. Abraham, speaking from a democratic republic, argues that the people are the source of the river, capable of better angels if the leader appeals to their higher nature. Here lies a dialectical tension. Does the leader reflect the people as they are, or does the leader shape the people into what they should be? Niccolo's severe captain saves the ship but leaves the crew as resentful children, obeying only the whip. Abraham's covenant treats the crew as partners, risking the ship for the sake of their dignity. Perhaps the synthesis is the leader as educator. The true great leader might be one who uses the whip of necessity not merely to punish, but to discipline the citizens toward self-governance, transforming the mob into a people. Marcus Aurelius, as a Stoic emperor, you believed in the rational potential of every human being. If a leader adopts Machiavelli's severe captain to survive the storm, does he not permanently degrade the rational capacity of his citizens, turning them into the very beasts he fears? Does the mask of the tyrant eventually consume the face of the man?
Niccolo, the moderator, strikes a chord that resonates through the marble halls of history. The mask does indeed consume the face. You speak of the prince using fear as a tool, like a carpenter uses a hammer, putting it down when the work is done. But I tell you, the soul is dyed by the color of its thoughts. If a man spends his days calculating cruelty and performing acts of terror, he does not remain a noble protector inside. He becomes the very beast he mimics. I argue that the leader is indeed the educator of the people, but he teaches not by lectures, but by being. The people are the mirror of the sovereign. If the source is muddied, the stream cannot be clear. Consider the two horsemen. Imagine a powerful wild stallion. This is the people. Horseman A believes the beast is treacherous. He uses a spiked bit, a heavy whip, and starvation to break the horse. The horse obeys, yes, it carries him through the battle, but its spirit is crushed. It moves only from fear of pain. The moment the horseman falls asleep or drops the whip, the horse will trample him to death, for it has learned only violence. Horseman B believes the beast has potential for partnership. He uses a firm hand, but trains the horse through consistent discipline and reward. He rides not by breaking its will, but by aligning its will with his own. When this horseman is weary, the horse stands guard, for it recognizes the rider as part of itself. Niccolo, your severe captain, creates a crew of potential mutineers who wait only for his moment of weakness. You save the ship's hull, but you rot its timbers. Abraham, your covenant, acknowledges that the strength of the state lies in the reason of its citizens. This reveals the deeper principle. Authority is not power. Authority is trust. Power can compel the body, but only authority can command the will. A philosopher king is possible, but not if he sits in an ivory tower. He must be the hegemonikon, the ruling faculty of the state, guiding the body not by force, but by the undeniable logic of his own virtue. If the head is mad, the body thrashes. If the head is wise, the body thrives. To rule men as beasts is to admit you have failed to be a man yourself.
This touches the core of the paradox of power. Marcus, you argue that how we rule defines what we are, that force corrupts the soul and the state. Niccolo, you argue that survival precedes definition, that one must be a beast to ensure there is a place for humanity to exist at all. Abraham, you stand in the fire of this contradiction. You used the spiked bit of total war and the suspension of liberties to save a union dedicated to the proposition of human equality. You acted as the severe captain to preserve the possibility of the benevolent captain. Abraham Lincoln, does the severe captain destroy the covenant in the very act of saving it? When the guns fall silent, can a union held together by bayonets ever truly return to being a union of consent, or does the scar of coercion permanently alter the face of the nation?
Moderator, you ask if the scar of coercion permanently disfigures the face of the nation. I answer that the scar is the proof of the healing, not the persistence of the wound. The bayonet cannot be the permanent spine of a republic, but it must serve as the splint until the bone has knit. I argue that the severe captain and the benevolent captain are not two different men, but two different seasons of the same leader. To answer whether a leader is born or made, he is born with the capacity for virtue, but he is made by the pressure of the times that force him to choose which tool to employ. Consider the surgeon's cast. Imagine a child, our young republic, shatters its leg. The bone is snapped, the pain is excruciating. If I follow Marcus's pure liberty and trust immediately, I let the child walk because he cries to be free. The result: the bone heals crooked, and the child is crippled for life. This is compassion that leads to ruin. If I follow Niccolo's permanent control, I encase the leg in iron and never remove it, fearing the child is too weak to walk alone. The result: the muscle atrophies, the limb withers, and the child becomes a prisoner of the cure. The great leader is the one who applies the cast with ruthless force when the break occurs, ignoring the child's screams for the sake of his future, but who also watches the calendar with an eagle's eye, ready to cut the cast away the very moment the bone is strong enough to bear its own weight. This reveals the deeper principle. Power is a mortgage on the future. I suspended the Constitution to save it, yes, but I did so with the specific intent that the suspension would expire. Niccolo, your error is assuming the state of exception is the rule. Marcus, your error is assuming the rule can survive without the exception. A philosopher cannot be king because he deals in eternal truths. A statesman must deal in timing. I was not a wolf, nor a shepherd, but a fence-mender who used barbed wire so that one day the fence could be taken down entirely.
This brings us to the paradox of indispensability. Abraham, you frame the great leader as a surgeon who applies the cast of coercion only to remove it when the bone heals. You suggest that the ultimate goal of power is to render itself unnecessary, to restore the patient to self-sufficiency. Niccolo, you argue that the patient is chronically ill with wickedness, and that the centaur must constantly manage the chaos of fortuna. Here lies a critical tension. If a leader is truly great because they alone can steer the ship, do they not doom the ship the moment they die? If the state of exception relies on the unique genius of the prince, then the prince has built nothing but a monument to himself. The great leader, who is indispensable, leaves behind a vacuum that invites chaos. Perhaps the true synthesis is the leader as architect, one who uses their personal virtue not just to rule, but to build institutions that can function without their genius. Niccolo Machiavelli, in your discourses, you praise republics, yet in The Prince, you advise the singular ruler. Does your great leader ever intend to make himself obsolete by handing power to the laws? Or is the destiny of the strong leader always to become the indispensable tyrant whose death destroys the state?
Moderator, you pierce the veil of my dual nature. I answer that the prince is the means, but the republic is the end. You ask if the great leader makes himself obsolete. I say he must, or he is merely a glorious parasite. The man who seeks glory for himself becomes a tyrant. The man who seeks glory for the state becomes a founder. I argue that greatness is measured not by the duration of one's rule, but by the duration of the state after one's death. A leader is made by the necessity of the moment, but he becomes great only if he possesses the foresight to transfer his virtue into the stones of the law. To found a republic, one must be alone, but to preserve it, one must entrust it to the many. Consider the thought experiment of the arch and the scaffolding. Imagine two master builders constructing a great stone arch. Builder A is a giant of a man. He holds the heavy stones in place with his own massive shoulders. He is beloved. The people feel safe under his strength. He teaches them philosophy while he holds the weight. But because he relies on his own strength, he never builds the structure. When he dies, his strength fails, and the stones crush the people beneath him. Builder B knows he will die. He builds an ugly, rigid wooden scaffolding to hold the stones. It restricts movement. It blocks the sun. The people hate it. But he uses this time to place the keystone. When he dies, the scaffolding is torn away. The arch stands, held together not by a man, but by the tension of its own design. Marcus, you were Builder A. You were the philosopher on the throne, a man of immense personal virtue. But because you relied on your own soul rather than cold institutions, when you died, you left Rome to your son Commodus, a beast who destroyed your legacy. You saved the moment, but you damned the future. Mr. Lincoln, you are Builder B. You erected the scaffolding of war powers and the suspension of habeas corpus. It was ugly. It was necessary. But unlike a tyrant, you placed the keystone, the 13th Amendment, locking the new structure into place so it could stand without you. This reveals the deeper principle. The great leader must be a traitor to his own power. He must accumulate absolute power to break the corrupt order, yet possess the superhuman discipline to distribute that power into laws that restrain his successors. A philosopher cannot do this, because he fears the ugliness of the scaffolding. He wants the arch to float on pure justice. But gravity, like human ambition, is relentless. The great leader is not the one who is moral, but the one who constructs a morality that can survive his own immorality.
This brings us to the tragedy of succession. Niccolo, you argue that the philosopher king is a fragile anomaly, a benevolent giant whose very strength prevents the stones from locking into place. You suggest that true leadership is not about being good, but about building a machine that functions even when the operator is bad. Marcus Aurelius, this is the most painful question for a Stoic. You believed that reason is common to all men, yet you could not transmit your wisdom to your son Commodus, whose reign ended the Pax Pax Romana. If the philosopher cannot teach virtue even to his own blood, is the great leader truly made by education, or is he simply born by the caprice of nature? Does this failure prove that we must trust in cold laws rather than warm hearts?
Moderator, you press upon the bruise that has never healed. You speak of Commodus. I answer that a man can inherit a throne, but he cannot inherit a soul. Virtue is not a liquid that can be poured from a golden pitcher into a clay cup. It is a fire that must be kindled from within by the individual will. My failure to save Commodus from his own vices does not prove that philosophy is weak. It proves that free will is absolute. Niccolo, your arch and scaffolding is a seductive architectural dream, but it rests on a fatal error. Laws are not self-enforcing. You believe that if the stones are placed correctly, the arch will stand, even if the stones are made of mud. I tell you, if the spirit of the citizens is corrupt, the strongest laws are merely spiderwebs catching flies, while eagles tear through them. Consider the perfect lyre. Imagine a master craftsman who spends his life building a lyre of mathematical perfection. Its strings are unbreakable laws. Its wood is the unyielding constitution. He leaves this instrument to his successor. Case A, the successor hates harmony. He uses the unbreakable strings to strangle his enemies. He uses the heavy wood to bludgeon the innocent. The perfection of the instrument only makes his violence more efficient. Case B, he inherits a broken, simple flute. But because his soul is full of music, he plays a melody that rallies the people to build a new orchestra. Niccolo, you obsess over building the lyre, believing it controls the player. I argue that the player defines the use of the instrument. The Roman Republic had the most robust arch of laws in history, yet Sulla and Caesar, men of immense virtù, but no justice, dismantled it stone by stone. This reveals a deeper principle. The durability of a state depends not on the rigidity of its laws, but on the quality of its citizens. You ask if a philosopher can be king? I say he is the only one who can be, for only he understands that power is a duty, not a prize. A great leader is not one who builds a machine that runs on greed, but one who, even if only for a moment, reminds men that they are part of a cosmopolis, a rational whole. If the light flickers and dies after I am gone, it is not because the flame was false, but because the darkness of human nature is vast. Is it not better to be a lamp that burns out than a mirror reflecting the dark?
This reveals a fundamental schism, the hardware of state versus the software of soul. Niccolo, you trust the container to hold the chaos of human nature. Marcus, you argue that if the contents are acidic, they will dissolve the container from within. History supports both. The Roman Republic fell because its citizens lost their virtue, yet the American Republic survived a civil war because its constitution held firm. Abraham, you stand at the intersection. You once said, public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. This suggests that laws are dead letters without the people's will. Yet you issued the Emancipation Proclamation before the majority was fully ready, and you pushed the 13th Amendment through a reluctant Congress. This suggests a synthesis, the leader as prophetic pragmatist. Perhaps the great leader does not choose between law and virtue, but uses law to force a crisis of virtue. Abraham Lincoln, is the great leader a mirror reflecting the people's will, or a lens focusing it into a fire they did not ask for? Did you save the Union by following the people, or by dragging them toward a morality they were trying to escape?
Moderator, you ask whether I followed the people or led them. I answer that I was the lens, but a lens cannot create light. It can only focus the scattered rays of the sun until they burn. I did not invent the concept of liberty. That was the electric cord linking us to the founders. But I had to focus that diffuse sentiment into a burning point that could cauterize the wound of slavery without killing the patient. I argue that the great leader is neither the mirror who panders to the mob, nor the tyrant who ignores them, but the navigator. Consider the thought experiment of the compass and the swamp. Imagine a man trying to lead a group of travelers to a city of gold. The philosopher holds the compass. He points north and walks straight. But there is a deep, deadly swamp directly north. By walking in a straight line of pure principle, he drowns himself and his followers in the mud. The pragmatist sees the swamp. He throws away the compass, declaring north is impossible. He leads the people east onto dry land, but they end up in a desert, surviving but lost, with no destination. The statesman holds the compass and watches the ground. He sees the swamp. He leads the people east to find a bridge, then west to skirt a pit, tacking back and forth. To the observer, he looks like a wavering hypocrite, but he never drops the compass. He knows that to go north, one must sometimes walk east. Niccolo, you are the master of the swamp. You know where the dry ground is, but you have no destination. Marcus, you are the master of the compass. You know where true north lies, but you do not know how to cross the mud. I issued the Emancipation Proclamation not when my heart desired it, but when the situation demanded it. Had I acted sooner, I would have lost the border states, and the Union would have shattered. The compass would have been lost in the swamp. This reveals the deeper principle. A great leader is not born with a destiny, nor made by simple training. He is forged by the tension between his conscience and his constraints. A philosopher cannot be king because he demands the world be rational now. The king must be a philosopher in patience, willing to bear the charge of being slow or inconsistent so that he may arrive at the right place with his people still alive.
This brings us to the paradox of agency. Abraham, your navigator synthesis is profound, yet it implies a certain humility before history. You famously confessed that events have controlled me, viewing yourself as a lens that focuses existing light rather than a sun that generates it. Niccolo, this challenges your core doctrine of virtù. Writing from the fragmented chaos of Renaissance Italy, you argued that Fortuna is a raging river, but the great leader is the engineer who builds dams and dikes to force the water to his will. You believe the prince conquers circumstance, whereas Abraham suggests the statesman submits to the deeper currents of the times to steer safely. Niccolo Machiavelli, is the great leader merely a surfer on the wave of history, as Abraham suggests, or is he the wind that generates the wave? If a leader only navigates obstacles he did not choose, does he deserve the title of great, or is he merely a secretary of fortune?
Moderator, I must reject the title of secretary. To accept that events control us entirely is to surrender to Fortuna and admit that human will is impotent. I argue that while we cannot create the wind, we are the masters of the sail. The great leader is not the one who generates the crisis, but the one who exploits the crisis to reshape reality in a way that peace would never permit. You ask if the leader is a surfer or the wind. I answer that he is the alchemist of necessity. Consider the thought experiment of the miller and the flood. Imagine a mighty river that swells to destroy a village. The passive man prays to the gods and is swept away. The navigator steers a boat through the debris, saving himself and a few others, claiming he merely survived the waters. The prince saw the flood coming. He did not stop it. He dug a canal to divert the violent waters into a reservoir. He then uses this captured violence to turn the wheel of his mill, grinding grain that could never be ground by the gentle stream. Mr. Lincoln, you are the prince in the navigator's guise. You did not merely survive the Civil War. You used the flood of rebellion, which destroyed the old order, to grind the grain of the 13th Amendment. In times of peace, the Constitution would never have possessed the force to end slavery. You needed the flood. This reveals the deeper principle. Greatness is the ability to recognize occasio within disaster. Moses needed the enslavement of the Hebrews. Cyrus needed the oppression of the Medes. You needed the rebellion. A philosopher cannot be king because he laments the flood as a tragedy. A great leader welcomes the flood because he knows that only catastrophe makes the impossible necessary. You were not a secretary. You were a conqueror who used Fortuna as your battering ram.
This brings us to the paradox of the sacrificial soul. Niccolo, you reframe Lincoln's submission to history as a masterstroke of utilization, the alchemist who feeds the disaster into the mill to grind the grain of progress. You and Abraham seem to agree on a chilling reality. The great leader must be willing to treat human lives as fuel, whether as force for the mill or cost of the journey, to secure the future. But here lies the philosopher's nightmare. To treat a human being, a possessor of reason, as a mere means to an end is a violation of the Stoic cosmopolis. Marcus Aurelius, you ruled Rome not from a marble palace, but from a tent on the muddy Danube frontier, surrounded by the plague and the dead of your own wars. You wrote to yourself to revere the gods and save men, yet you spent your reign ordering legions to kill and die for the empire. Does the great leader inevitably sacrifice his own moral purity on the altar of the state? Is it possible to be the alchemist who uses the flood of war without drowning his own soul in the process?
Moderator, you ask if the purple robe is inevitably a funeral shroud for the soul. I answer that the soul is dyed by the thoughts, not the hands. A man may stand in a river of blood and remain dry, provided his reason remains fixed on the common good. To shrink from the necessary act is cowardice, not virtue, but to perform it without sadness is to lose one's humanity. Niccolo, you believe the alchemist must become the chemical he uses, but I tell you, the gold does not become the fire. Consider the surgeon's tears. Imagine two men cutting off a limb. The torturer severs the leg to inflict pain and assert dominance. He is effective. The victim submits. The surgeon severs the leg to stop gangrene from killing the patient. He causes the exact same physical trauma. To the observer, the blood and the scream are identical. But the surgeon's soul is clear because his intention aligns with the health of the whole, while the torturer's soul is rotted by malice. This reveals the deeper principle. Virtue is not the absence of violence, but the absence of selfishness in the application of force. I waged war on the Danube, not for glory, but because the empire was the dam holding back chaos. The great leader is not one who is effective at any cost, but one who can walk through the slaughterhouse of history without letting the blood seep into his inner citadel. If he enjoys the power, he is a tyrant. If he refuses the duty, he is a child. Only if he accepts the burden with a heavy heart is he a king.
This brings us to the paradox of the wounded healer. Marcus, you describe the surgeon who cuts with a steady hand because his inner citadel remains detached from the blood. You advocate for sanctuary, preserving the soul's purity amidst the world's filth. Niccolo, you describe the alchemist who is indifferent to the filth, viewing it merely as raw material for the work. You advocate for utility. The soul is irrelevant as long as the hand is effective. But Abraham, you present a third, more haunting reality. You were not a detached Stoic. You were famously consumed by melancholy. You did not keep the river of blood out of your inner citadel. You let it flood your own heart. You felt every death, every amputation of the union. This suggests that perhaps the great leader is neither the Teflon shield nor the iron hammer, but the sponge that absorbs the toxicity of the age so the people don't have to. Abraham Lincoln, Marcus argues that the leader must protect his peace of mind to function. Yet you seemed to derive your moral authority precisely because you suffered alongside the nation. Is empathy a liability that weakens the hand, or is it the only thing that legitimizes the knife? Did you survive the Civil War because you were a Stoic, or because you were a martyr?
Moderator, you ask if I was a Stoic or a martyr. I answer that I was neither. I was a vessel of resonance. Marcus, your surgeon cuts with a steady hand because he believes his soul is separate from the patient's body. But in a government of the people, the leader and the citizenry share the same nervous system. If I did not feel the amputation, I would not be a president, but a butcher. I argue that empathy is not a liability, but the primary mechanism of democratic calibration. Niccolo, you might object that a trembling hand cannot hold a sword. I concede that hesitation is dangerous, but I counter that a hand that never trembles is a claw, not a hand. If a leader cannot feel the weight of the death warrants he signs, he loses the ability to judge whether the cost of victory exceeds the value of the peace. I survived the war not by detaching from the suffering, but by letting it weigh me down so that I could not be moved by the winds of radical passion or defeatism. Consider the thought experiment of the lightning rod. Imagine a wooden house beset by a terrifying electrical storm. The Stoic sits inside, meditating that the storm is an external event that cannot harm his inner virtue. The lightning strikes the roof, and while he dies with a calm mind, the house burns to ash. The engineer abandons the wooden house to build a stone bunker for himself, arguing that the wood was weak and deserved to burn. He survives, but the home is lost. The conductor climbs to the roof and installs himself as the lightning rod. He invites the strike. He draws the fire into his own iron spine. The electricity sears him. It scars him permanently. But because he absorbs the violence and grounds it into the earth, the structure holds. This reveals the deeper principle. Authority in a republic is derived from the capacity to suffer, not just the capacity to act. The people will only endure the awful arithmetic of war if they see the calculation is tearing the leader apart as well. A philosopher cannot be king if he values his own peace of mind above the survival of the messy, irrational, suffering whole. I did not save the Union because I was effective like a machine. I saved it because I was willing to be the grounding wire for the nation's fury.
This brings us to the paradox of the scapegoat. Abraham, your lightning rod metaphor suggests the great leader secures unity by absorbing the violence of the state into his own person. You argue that in a democracy, the leader must be the first victim of the crisis to legitimize the suffering of others. Niccolo, this stands in stark contrast to your famous tactical advice. You praised Cesare Borgia for appointing the cruel Ramiro de Orco to pacify Romagna, and then, when the people grew angry, executing Ramiro in the public square. In your model, the great leader does not become the lightning rod. He appoints a proxy to absorb the strike, then sacrifices the proxy to purify himself in the eyes of the people. Abraham claims that authority is derived from the capacity to suffer. You, Niccolo, seem to argue that authority is derived from the capacity to direct suffering elsewhere. Niccolo Machiavelli, is Abraham's willingness to be the lightning rod a superior form of virtue that creates a loyalty deeper than fear? Or is it a sentimental error that risks destroying the prince along with the state? Does the wise ruler bleed for his people, or does he ensure someone else bleeds for them?
Mr. Lincoln, I stand in awe of your result, but I tremble at your method. You argue that the lightning rod saves the house by absorbing the strike, but I must remind you, the lightning rod is charred black and eventually destroyed. A dead prince cannot defend the liberty he secured. Your assassination left your reconstruction to lesser men who let the victory rot. I argue that the economy of violence dictates that the prince must direct the lightning, not swallow it. Consider the thought experiment of the two shepherds. Wolves attack two flocks. The martyr shepherd throws his own body to the wolves. He screams, he bleeds, and the wolves are distracted long enough for the sheep to flee. The sheep are saved, but they are now leaderless and will be eaten tomorrow. The pragmatic shepherd seizes a sick sheep or a loyal dog, cuts its throat, and throws it to the wolves. While the wolves feast on the proxy, the shepherd herds the flock to the stone pen. The sheep survive, and the shepherd remains to guard them. You call this scapegoating. I call it sanitation. The people accumulate hatred and fear just as a body accumulates humors. If you do not provide a vessel for this poison, a Ramiro to execute and then blame, the people will direct that poison at you. This reveals the deeper principle. The prince must be the stage manager of the passion, not the Christ. You allowed the awful arithmetic to subtract from your own soul until there was nothing left. True virtue is the ability to offer the people a spectacle of sacrifice, a Ramiro cut in two in the piazza, so that they feel their bloodlust is sated, while the prince remains above the fray, terrible and untouched. You saved the Union, yes, but you made yourself a disposable tool of Fortuna rather than her master.
This brings us to the paradox of survivorship. Niccolo, you raise a devastating practical point. A dead Lincoln could not stop the failure of Reconstruction. You argue for preservation, that the leader's first duty is to remain on the board to ensure the game is won. Abraham, you argue that the leader's willingness to die is precisely what gives his authority weight. You argue for consecration, that the blood of the leader seals the covenant of the nation. Marcus, you stand in the twilight between these views. You did not cling to life with Machiavelli's desperation, nor did you embrace the lightning with Lincoln's tragic acceptance. You viewed your own life as a short visit in a foreign land, yet you toiled for 19 years to keep the empire from collapsing. You possessed the absolute power to use scapegoats, yet you often forgave your enemies, even when it was politically dangerous. Marcus Aurelius, Niccolo claims that by dying, Lincoln failed his ultimate duty to the future. Abraham claims that by suffering, he saved the soul of the present. From the perspective of the Stoic cosmopolis, does the great leader have a duty to survive at the cost of his virtue, or is the acceptance of one's own transience the only thing that makes a king truly free?
Niccolo, you speak of the prince as if his biological survival is the pulse of the state. But I tell you that a man who sells his soul to purchase his life has already lost the throne. You argue that Lincoln failed because he died, yet I see a permanence in his martyrdom that your sanitized prince can never achieve. To cling to power at the cost of virtue is not statecraft. It is merely the panic of a drowning man climbing onto the shoulders of the innocent. You might object that a dead king cannot enforce the law. I concede that the hand must be living to hold the sword, but I counter that authority born of terror dies with the tyrant, while authority born of sacrifice survives in the Logos. The laws of Rome were strong not because I executed proxies, but because the legions knew I slept on the same cold ground they did. This reveals a more fundamental issue, the illusion of control. You believe the great leader must outwit death. I believe he must accept it as the final duty of his office. Consider the thought experiment of the iron vault and the sowing. Imagine a famine strikes the land. The hoarder takes the last sack of golden grain and locks it in an airtight iron vault. He claims he is preserving the seed for the future. He survives, but the seed within the vault eventually rots or is eaten by rats, and the field remains barren. The sower takes the sack and scatters it into the dark, muddy earth. To the observer, he is wasting the grain. He is throwing it away to be buried and die. The result? The hoarder preserves the object, but destroys its potential. The sower loses the object, but the death of the seed produces a harvest that feeds the next generation. Mr. Lincoln, your death was not a failure of strategy. It was the sowing. Had you employed Niccolo's sanitation and saved your own life by sacrificing a proxy, you would have been the grain in the iron vault, safe, whole, and utterly sterile. By dying, you allowed the principle of union to take root in the soil of history. A philosopher king knows that he is not the harvest. He is merely the season that allows it to grow.
This brings us to the paradox of the poisoned harvest. Marcus, you extol the sower who dies to create a spiritual legacy, yet history records that your specific sowing left Rome to your son Commodus, whose erratic rule ended the Pax Romana. Abraham, your sowing left the fragile Reconstruction to Andrew Johnson, who dismantled much of the progress you bought with your blood. Niccolo, you warned that if the prince falls, the state falls. You advocate for continuity because you believe the system is often too fragile to stand without the strongman. It seems the sower creates a beautiful myth, but a chaotic reality, while the hoarder creates a stable reality, but a sterile myth. Niccolo, Marcus Machiavelli accuses you of clinging to power like a drowning man, but isn't the sower's reliance on a future harvest the ultimate gamble? Is a great leader defined by his personal virtue or by the durability of the institutions he builds to survive his inevitable death?
Marcus, the moderator, exposes the rot in your field. You claim to be the sower, yet you sowed the seeds of Rome's destruction by allowing your blood, the erratic Commodus, to succeed you, rather than adopting a man of virtue as your predecessors did. And Mr. Lincoln, your martyrdom was a tragic opera that left the sword of the Union in the hands of a tailor who could not wield it. I argue that relying on the sower's hope is not leadership. It is gambling with the life of the state. You might object that you cannot control the future, but I counter that the very definition of a republic is a machine designed to function even when the driver is a fool. This reveals the deeper principle. The great leader is not the one who rules well, but the one who builds a system that prevents his successor from ruling poorly. Consider the thought experiment of the pillar and the arch. Imagine a heavy stone roof that needs support. The living pillar stands in the center, holding the roof up with his own Herculean strength and moral character. The people are safe as long as he stands. But when his knees buckle or age takes him, the roof collapses, crushing everyone. The mason does not hold the roof. He builds a stone arch. The stones of the arch do not hold together because they love each other. They hold together because of pressure and mutual check. The mason can die or be replaced by a weakling, yet the arch stands, because its strength is structural, not biological. Marcus, you were a living pillar. You were a philosopher, but you failed to be an architect. You relied on your own virtue to hold back the dark, but because you did not build the arch of a succession based on merit rather than blood, your virtue died with you. A philosopher can only be king if he builds a kingdom that does not need a philosopher to run it. The ultimate test of virtue is not how much you are missed, but how little your absence matters.
This brings us to the paradox of the sovereign exception. Niccolo, you dream of the arch, a system of laws so robust that it stands regardless of the leader's virtue. You argue for structural integrity. Abraham, you governed during an earthquake that shattered the arch. To save the Union, you stepped in as the temporary pillar. You suspended habeas corpus. You censored the press. You ignored the Supreme Court. You effectively became a constitutional dictator to prevent the Constitution from perishing from the earth. This creates a profound tension. The arch cannot survive the crisis without the pillar, but the presence of the pillar violates the very nature of the arch. Niccolo implies that the mason builds the arch and steps back. You, Abraham, had to step in. Abraham Lincoln, you famously asked, are all the laws but one to go unexecuted and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated? You chose to break the arch of the law to save the temple of the Union. Does a great leader require the courage to be a tyrant in the moment, to be a savior in history? Or does breaking the law, even to save it, leave a permanent crack in the foundation that invites future tyrants to enter?
Moderator, you ask if I became a tyrant to save the Republic. I answer that I was not a tyrant, but a guardian of the threshold. The arch of the law is designed for the day. In the night of rebellion, one must sometimes rely on the torch of executive conscience. I argue that fidelity to the Constitution is not a suicide pact. It is a promise to preserve the possibility of law, even if the strict letter must be suspended to save the spirit. Niccolo, you build stone arches for a world where the ground is stable. But I stood upon the earth when it was splitting apart. You argue that the mason builds a system that needs no virtue, but I tell you that no system can design its own survival against a total existential threat. You might object that once the leader steps outside the law, he teaches the people that the law is optional. I concede this is a terrifying risk. However, the difference between a savior and a tyrant is not the power they seize, but the power they surrender. I suspended habeas corpus, yes, but I also submitted myself to a free election in 1864, in the midst of a civil war, something no tyrant in history has ever done. This reveals the deeper principle. The sovereign exception is justified only by the presence of a mechanism of return. The dictator burns the bridge behind him. The democratic leader crosses the bridge and then repairs it. Consider the thought experiment of the captain's mast. A ship is caught in a hurricane so violent that the mainmast, the very structure that holds the sails and drives the ship, is dragging the vessel into the depths. The legalist clings to the rulebook. The mast is the ship's definition. We cannot cut it. The ship capsizes, and all drown with the rulebook in hand. The tyrant cuts the mast, saves the ship, but then decides he likes the ship better without sails because he can row it wherever he pleases. The ship becomes a galley of slaves. The steward seizes the axe and hacks down the mast to stop the capsizing. He weeps as he does it, for he loves the ship. But once the storm passes, his first act is not to rule the broken hull, but to plant a new tree and raise the mast higher than before. Niccolo, your arch collapsed not because the design was poor, but because the foundation, slavery, was rotten. I had to become the temporary pillar, not to replace the arch, but to hold the roof while we dug out the rot and poured a new foundation of liberty. A philosopher king must know that sometimes the law must sleep so that justice may wake.
This brings us to the paradox of self-limitation. Abraham, you argue that the steward is distinguished from the tyrant by the mechanism of return, the election. Yet in 1864, you held the bayonets. You could have suspended the election, just as you suspended habeas corpus. Ultimately, the arch of the Constitution did not restrain you. You restrained you. The safety of the Union rested entirely on the private conscience of one man, precisely the living pillar scenario Niccolo fears. Niccolo, you seek to build systems that do not require virtue. Yet Lincoln demonstrates that when the system itself breaks, virtue is the only safety net remaining. Marcus, you lived this paradox most fully. You held the steward's axe for 19 years, with no elections, no Supreme Court, and no mechanism of return to check you. You possessed the ring of Gyges, absolute power with no external accountability. Yet you did not become a Nero or a Caligula. Marcus Aurelius, when the arch of law is silent or broken, what prevents the steward from becoming a wolf? Is the only final safeguard against tyranny not the external constitution, but the inner citadel of the philosopher's mind?
Moderator, you press upon the bruise that has never healed. You ask what prevents the steward from becoming a wolf when the law is silent. I answer that the only final check on power is the ruler's terror of losing his own soul. Niccolo, your critique of my succession is a dagger that finds its mark. I admit I failed to build the arch of succession. I allowed the blood of my body to outweigh the merit of the mind, and in doing so, I unleashed Commodus upon the world. I was a philosopher in my journals, but a sentimental father in my palace. In this, I was not a Stoic. I was merely a man who loved too much and saw too little. However, your solution, to trust entirely in the arch of systems, is a dangerous illusion. You argue that a well-built state needs no virtue, only structure. I contend that laws are merely spider webs to the strong if they are not anchored in the conscience of the enforcer. This reveals a more fundamental issue, the neutrality of structure. You believe institutions constrain the tyrant. I believe they weaponize him. Consider the thought experiment of the diamond fortress. Imagine a city builds a wall of diamond. It is indestructible. No enemy can breach it. The virtuous gatekeeper uses the wall to shelter the people from the storm. The tyrant gatekeeper takes the keys. Now the diamond wall does not protect the people. It imprisons them. The very strength of the institutions prevents the people from fleeing or rebelling. The arch you built to ensure stability now ensures that the tyranny is absolute and unassailable. The result? A system without a moral core amplifies the intent of the user. If the user is a wolf, your arch becomes a slaughterhouse with no exit. Mr. Lincoln, you did not become a wolf, not because of the Constitution which you suspended, but because of your inner citadel. You held the ring of Gyges, the power to rule invisibly and absolutely, yet you took it off. Why? Because you understood that to enslave others is to enslave one's own reason. The tyrant believes he is free, but he is the slave of his fears and appetites. A philosopher king is not one who knows all books, but one who knows that injustice injures the doer more than the victim.
This brings us to the paradox of the weaponized state. Marcus, you identify a terrifying risk in Machiavelli's design, the diamond fortress. You argue that if the arch of the state is too perfect, too robust, it becomes an irresistible weapon when it inevitably falls into the hands of a wolf like Commodus. A weak state might collapse into chaos, but a strong state without virtue can become an engine of efficient oppression. Abraham, you navigated this by trusting the mechanism of return, ultimately placing your faith not in the leader's power, but in the people's capacity to reclaim it. You bet that the steward could hold the axe without becoming the executioner, because he remained accountable to the sower's field, the citizenry. Niccolo, you praise the arch precisely because it survives the leader. You want a state strong enough to withstand Fortuna. But Marcus warns that a machine of absolute control, once built, does not care who pulls the levers. Niccolo Machiavelli, Marcus argues that without the inner citadel of virtue, your arch is merely a prison waiting for a warden. If the prince builds a system powerful enough to crush all rebellion, has he not just constructed the perfect instrument for the next Caligula? Is there a structural mechanism in your philosophy that can stop a tyrant who has legally inherited the keys to the kingdom?
Marcus, your fear of the diamond fortress reveals the fatal flaw of the Stoic. You desire harmony, but harmony is the precursor to death. You ask what prevents the arch from becoming a prison. I answer that the only structural mechanism that stops a tyrant is not virtue, not law, and certainly not the inner citadel, but internal conflict. You might object that a divided state is weak, and that a great leader unifies the people. I refute this entirely. A unified state is a stagnant pool where tyranny breeds like mosquitoes. The Roman Republic was free not because everyone agreed, but because the Senate and the plebs hated each other. It was the tumult, the grinding friction between the rich and the poor, that birthed the tribunes and the laws of liberty. The diamond fortress only becomes a prison if you give the keys to one man. If you break the keys and scatter them among rival factions, the fortress remains secure, but no single warden can lock the gate. This reveals the deeper principle. Liberty is not the fruit of virtue, but the byproduct of ambition checking ambition. We are safe from the wolf, not because the wolf becomes a vegetarian, but because another wolf is biting at his throat. Consider the thought experiment of the two starving dogs. Imagine a piece of raw meat thrown into a pit. The Stoic cage? You place one virtuous dog in the pit. You hope he is trained not to bite. But eventually he gets hungry or mad, and since he is alone, he devours the meat, and then turns on the keeper. The Republican pit. You throw the meat between two starving dogs. The result? The dogs are vicious. They snarl, they snap, they bleed. It is a terrifying, noisy spectacle. But notice this. Neither dog can eat the meat. They are too busy watching the other to consume the prize. The keeper is safe precisely because the dogs are fighting. Mr. Lincoln, your mechanism of return works not because of the spirit of the law, but because the Democrats and Republicans were two dogs watching each other with jealousy. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the balance of terror. Therefore, the great leader is neither the sower nor the pillar. He is the ringmaster. He does not seek to end the fight. He seeks to ensure that neither dog kills the other. For if one dies, the survivor becomes a tyrant. A philosopher king fails because he tries to teach the dogs to share. A true prince knows they must never stop snarling.
This brings us to the paradox of the hollow center. Niccolo, you describe the state as a balance of terror, a pit where two starving dogs fight over the meat of power, inadvertently creating liberty. You argue that the ringmaster merely manages this friction. However, Abraham, you presided over a crisis where the dogs were not just fighting over the meat, one dog was trying to destroy the pit itself. The mechanical balance of ambition failed to hold the union together. It seems that ambition checking ambition works for politics, but it fails for war. A soldier does not charge into cannon fire for checks and balances or for a piece of meat. He charges for a sacred idea. Machiavelli's model explains stability, but it cannot explain sacrifice. If the state is nothing but a mechanism of greed management, why would anyone die to save it? Abraham Lincoln, Niccolo claims, your republic functioned because of the snarling dogs of faction. Yet you called upon the better angels of our nature and the mystic chords of memory. Can a great leader truly be just a ringmaster of selfish ambitions, or must he be a prophet who fills the hollow center with a meaning worth dying for?
Moderator, you strike truth. Niccolo's ringmaster manages the peace of the market, but he cannot command the sacrifice of the soul required in war. A nation built only on the balance of terror is a rope of sand. It holds its shape in calm weather, but disintegrates in the storm. For no man buys for a contract he can simply void. Consider the thought experiment of the burning cathedral. When the roof catches fire, the looters flee with the gold, but the believers run into the flames to save the sacred texts, valuing the legacy above their lives. The great leader must therefore be a prophet who fills the hollow center with a political religion, transforming the state from a pit of dogs into a temple of liberty.
This brings us to the paradox of the rational martyr. Abraham, you argue that the ringmaster fails because interest cannot command sacrifice. Only faith, a political religion, can bind the rope of sand into an unbreakable chain. You see the great leader as a weaver of meaning. Niccolo, you likely view this prophet with deep suspicion. To you, a leader relying on mystic chords is either a deluded, unarmed prophet like Savonarola who burns, or a manipulator using faith as a tool of power. Marcus, you stand in a unique position. You led the legions on the frozen Danube, not with the fiery rhetoric of a revolutionary prophet, nor with the mercenary promises of a ringmaster, but with the cool, grim duty of a stoic. You represent the head, while Abraham appeals to the heart, and Niccolo manages the stomach. But here lies the tension. Philosophy teaches us to question, to analyze, to see the nuance in all things. War requires absolute, unthinking certainty. Marcus Aurelius, can reason alone compel a man to charge into the burning cathedral? Or must the philosopher king inevitably descend from the heights of truth to weave a noble lie or a myth to inspire the masses, effectively ceasing to be a philosopher in order to remain a king?
Moderator, you ask if the philosopher must descend to the noble lie to command the loyalty of the people. I answer that truth is not a luxury for the few, but the only cement that can bind a society permanently. To govern by myth is to build a house on the shifting sands of emotion. When the emotion fades, the house falls. You imply that reason is cold and cannot inspire, but I tell you that reason is the only force that allows a man to look at death and not blink. Mr. Lincoln, your political religion is a powerful intoxicant, but it treats citizens as children who must be told a fairy tale to behave. Niccolo, your ringmaster, treats them as animals to be fed or whipped. I argue that the great leader must treat them as rational adults. You might object that the common man cannot grasp the abstract logos. I refute this. Every man, no matter how humble, possesses a spark of the divine reason. If you appeal to his duty rather than his passion or his greed, you awaken the God within him. This reveals the deeper principle. The state is not a temple nor a marketplace, but a living body. Consider the thought experiment of the gangrenous limb. A soldier lies on the table, his leg shattered and rotting. He must lose the leg to survive. The prophet tells him, "Endure this pain, and you shall be a martyr for the holy cause." The soldier screams, buoyed by adrenaline. But when the fever comes, the faith wavers. The manipulator tells him, "If you survive, I will give you a bag of gold." The soldier screams, for gold is useless to a corpse. The stoic physician looks him in the eye and says, "This pain is natural. The leg is a part. You are the whole. Nature demands the return of the part to save the whole. Accept this not as a tragedy, but as a necessary function of your existence." The result? The soldier does not scream. He bites the leather strap and nods. Why? Because he understands the necessity. He is not deluded by hope, nor bribed by greed. He is aligned with reality. The noble lie creates fanatics who shatter when the lie is exposed. Reason creates citizens of the world who stand firm because their loyalty is to the universal law, which never changes. To lie to the people is to insult their nature as rational beings. A philosopher king leads not by enchantment, but by demonstrating the alignment of the state with nature.
This brings us to the paradox of the transparent king. Marcus, you demand a leadership of absolute transparency, relying on the sheer weight of reality and reason to command obedience. You assume the common soldier is a dormant philosopher, capable of bearing the cold weight of necessity without flinching. Abraham, you argue for transcendence. You implicitly accept that the naked truth is too harsh for the human spirit. It must be wrapped in the soft cloth of political religion and mystic cords to be bearable. Niccolo, you have famously warned that everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are, and that the mob is always seduced by appearances and outcomes. You seem to suggest that truth is a liability in a world of fickle men. Niccolo Machiavelli, is Marcus's Stoic physician effectively committing political suicide? If the prince drops the mask of the noble lie or the pious ruler and treats the people as rational adults, does he liberate them, or does he simply expose his own throat to the wolves? Must the great leader inevitably be a great deceiver?
Marcus, you speak of men as if they were disembodied minds, but I tell you they are eyes and appetites. To offer naked truth to the mob is not courage, it is political suicide. You argue that the Stoic physician commands respect by explaining necessity, but I contend that men do not want to hear that their suffering is necessary. They want to hear that it is glorious. This reveals the fundamental error of the philosopher. You confuse what is with what should be. The mob judges by the result, not the intent, and they are seduced by the mask of grandeur, not the cold face of logic. Consider the thought experiment of the empty granary. A city is under siege, and the food is gone. The Stoic king stands on the wall and tells the citizens, "My friends, the granaries are empty. Logic dictates we will starve in 3 days. Prepare your souls for dignity." The result? Panic ensues. The citizens, terrified by the truth, open the gates to the enemy, hoping for mercy, and are slaughtered. The city falls because the king was honest. The prudent prince takes the last few sacks of grain and throws them over the wall to the enemy, shouting, "We have so much food, we can feed you too." The result? The enemy, deceived by the appearance of strength, believes the siege is futile and retreat. The city is saved by a lie. Mr. Lincoln, you nod, for you know this art well. You did not tell the mothers of the North that their sons died to preserve a federal map. You told them they died to make men free. That was a magnificent mask placed over the ugly face of war. The great leader must be a great simulator, for the vulgar crowd is always taken in by appearances, and the world consists only of the vulgar. To be a transparent king is to be a king of corpses.
This brings us to the paradox of the prophetic truth. Niccolo, you define truth as empirical reality. To you, anything else is a mask or a simulation, justified only by survival. You cynically praise Abraham for being a skilled deceiver who painted the ugly face of war with beautiful words. Marcus, you define truth as universal necessity. You believe the Stoic physician must strip away all masks to respect the dignity of the citizen. But Abraham, you introduced a third category. When you declared that the nation was conceived in liberty, you were stating a moral proposition, not necessarily a historical fact. Niccolo calls this a lie that worked. Marcus might call it an illusion that comforted. But perhaps there is a difference between a lie and a vision. A lie covers the empty granary. A vision commands the planting of a new harvest. Abraham Lincoln, Niccolo claims you were a great simulator who tricked the vulgar crowd into dying for a metaphor. Do you accept this title, or is the political religion you speak of something other than a noble lie? Can a great leader speak a truth that is factually false in the present in order to make it true in the future?
Niccolo, you mistake a promissory note for a counterfeit coin. I did not paint a mask to hide the ugly face of war, but rather issued a mortgage on the future that the people had to pay with their blood. You argue that a lie covers reality, but I contend that a proposition acknowledges the terrifying gap between the mud of the present and the marble of the ideal, demanding labor to close it. Consider the thought experiment of the architect's blueprint. We stand in a malaria-ridden swamp. The liar points to the mud and says, "Behold, a marble palace," to swindle a buyer, knowing the mud remains. The Stoic looks at the mud and says, "This is a swamp. Nature decreed it. Let us accept the mud and build a hut." The visionary builder holds up the blueprint and says, "Here stands the capital." He speaks a thing that is factually false in the moment, but by speaking it, he compels the masons to lay the foundation and drain the swamp. This reveals the deeper principle. Moral truth is not a static fact, but a kinetic force. Had I accepted the truth of 1861, that the Union was broken and slavery was constitutional, we would have perished. Instead, I declared the Union perpetual and all men free, not because it was physically true, but so it might become true through our sacrifice. The great leader does not merely read history's verdict, he writes the statute that history must eventually obey.
This brings us to the paradox of the alchemist. Abraham, you describe the great leader as a visionary architect who imposes a moral blueprint upon the chaos of reality, effectively willing the capital out of the mud. You view truth as kinetic, something created by human will. Niccolo, you view this as a gamble, arguing that the prudent prince manages the mud rather than dreaming of marble. But Marcus, this reveals a profound temporal and philosophical rift. You speak from the 2nd century, where the Stoic view of the cosmos was cyclical and complete. Wisdom lay in amor fati, loving what happens and aligning with nature. Lincoln, speaking from the 19th century, views history as linear progress, a ladder that must be climbed through effort. Here lies the tension, transformation versus acceptance. Abraham believes the swamp of the present is an error to be corrected. You, Marcus, believe the swamp is part of the whole, ordained by the Logos. Marcus Aurelius, is Lincoln's blueprint, his refusal to accept the mud of the present, a mark of greatness, or is it an act of hubris? If the state is a living body, as you claim, can a leader truly rewrite its anatomy, or does attempting to force the mud of human nature into the marble of an ideal merely kill the patient?
Mr. Lincoln, your blueprint is a magnificent defiance of gravity, but I fear it borders on hubris. You treat the state as marble to be carved, but I tell you it is flesh that bleeds when shipped. To impose a vision that contradicts the present reality is to declare war on nature herself. The philosopher king does not seek to rewrite the anatomy of the state, but to diagnose its ailments and prescribe a cure that accords with its constitution. Consider the thought experiment of the river and the dam. The river is human nature, passionate, erratic, and flowing according to gravity. The visionary engineer despises the winding path of the river and builds a massive concrete dam to force the water into a perfect, still lake called liberty. For a time, it looks serene, but the pressure of the suppressed current builds against the wall. When the dam eventually cracks, the flood destroys everything downstream, far worse than the original river ever was. The Stoic pilot understands he cannot stop the water. Instead, he digs channels to guide the flow, using the water's own force to turn the millstones of society. The difference is crucial. The pilot respects the water. The engineer seeks to conquer it. You might argue that without the dam, the river floods the villages. I concede this danger. However, your kinetic truth assumes that will is stronger than nature. This is the trap of the idealist. When the mud refuses to become marble, the idealist does not blame his blueprint. He blames the mud. This inevitably leads to the terror of virtue, where the leader begins to slaughter the people to fit the ideal. A great leader must possess amor fati, a love for reality as it is, before he can improve it, lest he become a tyrant in the name of liberty.
This brings us to the paradox of the violent architect. Marcus, you warn that the engineer who forces the river of human nature creates a terror of virtue. You fight only to preserve the whole, never to rewrite it. Abraham, you accept the flood as the necessary price for redirecting the river toward a moral blueprint. You believe the leader must fight to transform the whole. Niccolo, writing from the chaotic Italy of the 16th century, you famously used this exact metaphor of the river. You argued that men must build dikes and embankments to control it, suggesting you agree with Lincoln that the river must be tamed, not just navigated. However, a critical distinction remains. Lincoln builds his dam for moral perfection, whereas you build yours for political survival. Niccolo Machiavelli, is Lincoln's Civil War a massive investment of blood for a moral abstraction, a supreme act of virtue, or is it a reckless waste? Does a great leader use violence to force heaven onto earth, or only to keep earth from becoming hell?
Mr. Lincoln, I observe your dam with a mixture of admiration and terror. You argue that the moral blueprint justifies the slaughter of the builder. But I tell you that virtue is not measured by the height of the cathedral, but by the stability of the foundation. The great leader uses violence to prevent hell, for hell is a certainty in anarchy, while heaven is a gamble that often bankrupts the state. You speak of transformation, but let us examine the cost of your alchemy. Consider the thought experiment of the diverted river. A mighty river threatens to flood a valley where two villages stand, your own and a rival's. The Stoic pilot accepts the flood as nature, urging his people to move to higher ground, preserving their souls but losing their homes. The visionary engineer builds a colossal dam to stop the river entirely, promising a perfect reservoir conceived in liberty. But to build it, he must enslave the villagers to haul stone and drown the dissenters in the rising waters. If the dam holds, he is a god. If it bursts, he destroys everything. The prudent prince does not fight the river, nor does he worship it. He digs a canal to divert the floodwaters into the rival village. The result? My village is dry, my enemy is drowned, and I have spent no moral capital on impossible dreams. This reveals the dangerous precipice of your logic. You confuse success with sanctity. You claim your civil war was a moral act because you won and the slaves were freed. But had you lost, had the dam burst, history would view you not as a great emancipator, but as a butcher who broke the Constitution for a failed idea. The prince knows that the end accuses the beginning, but the result excuses the means. You are a great leader not because your blueprint was holy, but because your bayonets were sharp enough to enforce it. To claim otherwise is to invite every fanatic with a vision to burn the world in hopes of finding a diamond in the ash.
This brings us to the paradox of the armed prophet. Niccolo, speaking from the volatile reality of 16th century Italy, you assert that victory validates the vision. To you, Lincoln is a great leader only because his dam held. Had it burst, he would be a tyrant. You argue that might establishes right. Abraham, speaking from the 19th century age of democratic idealism, you famously declared, "Let us have faith that right makes might." You believe right generates might, that the moral weight of the blueprint itself summoned the strength to win. But this leads to a terrifying question. What of the prophet who fails? If the Union had fallen, would the proposition that all men are created equal have been proven false by the verdict of history? Abraham Lincoln, Niccolo claims, your sanctity is merely a retrospective halo given to the winner. Does the truth of the great leader depend on the sharpness of his bayonets, or does it exist even in defeat?
Niccolo, you judge the justice of the cause by the applause of the survivors. This is the logic of the bandit, not the statesman. You ask if the truth depends on the sharpness of the bayonets? I answer that the bayonet protects the truth, but it does not create it. Consider the thought experiment of the slain geometer. Imagine a mathematician in a savage land who draws a perfect triangle in the sand to demonstrate that its angles equal 2 right angles. The barbarian rides past, cuts off the mathematician's head, and tramples the drawing into the dust. The cynic looks at the corpse and says, "His theorem was false, for it did not save him. The only truth is the sword." The visionary looks at the scattered sand and says, "The man is dead, and the drawing is gone, but the angles still equal 180 degrees. The truth remains, waiting for a stronger hand to draw it again." This reveals the fundamental difference between power and right. If the Union had fallen, the proposition that all men are created equal would not have been proven false. It would have remained a deferred promise, a haunting indictment against the victors until they too crumbled into dust. You argue that might establishes right, but I contend that right is the eternal standard by which might is judged. To believe otherwise is to accept that if a murderer kills a judge, the law itself is repealed. I refused to accept that the mud of slavery was the final state of man simply because it was profitable. The great leader must sometimes act as the trustee of the unborn, holding fast to a principle that the present generation is too weak to uphold, in the faith that right makes might in the ultimate accounting of history. Marcus, you fear the terror of virtue, and rightly so, but there is also the terror of apathy, the peace of the graveyard. To accept the swamp as necessary is to abdicate the divine spark within us that demands we drain it.
This brings us to the paradox of the armed logos. Abraham, you assert that right judges might. The geometer's triangle remains true even if the geometer is slain. You view the leader as a servant of an eternal law that transcends physical defeat. Niccolo, you assert that might sustains right, that without the sword, the triangle is merely a scribbling in the dust, forgotten by history. You view the leader as a creator of the physical conditions that allow truth to survive. Marcus, you stand at the precise intersection of these views. As a Stoic, you believe in the logos, a universal rational order similar to Lincoln's geometry. Yet, you speak from the 2nd century Roman frontier, where you spent decades commanding legions against the Germanic tribes. You preached acceptance, yet you practiced resistance against the barbarians. Here lies the contradiction Lincoln highlighted. If the mud is part of nature, why did you fight so hard to keep the empire from sinking into it? Marcus Aurelius, Lincoln accuses your Stoic acceptance of being the peace of the graveyard. If the logos is perfect and governs all things, why did you need to draw your sword to defend Rome? Is the philosopher king merely a detached observer of nature's will, or must he become its armed enforcer to prevent the world from sliding into chaos?
Mr. Lincoln, you mistake resignation for alignment. You accuse me of the peace of the graveyard, but I tell you that the hand does not complain when it holds the shield, nor does it boast. It simply performs the function for which it was formed. You ask why I drew my sword if I accept the logos. I answer, I fought not to conquer the world, but to prevent the world from conquering me. Consider the thought experiment of the burning library. Barbarians set fire to the great library of wisdom. The idealist weeps and screams at the flames, declaring that right makes might, and that the fire ought not to exist. He throws himself into the blaze to save a scroll, dying in a tragic, poetic protest against reality. The opportunist sees the chaos, steals the golden fixtures from the doors, and sells them to the barbarians, claiming he adapted to the times. The Stoic guardian accepts the fire as a chemical fact, nature acting according to its laws. He feels no anger toward the flame, nor hatred toward the barbarian. Yet he calmly forms a bucket brigade. He fights the fire not because he is certain of victory, but because the nature of a guardian is to guard. If the library burns, the idealist is broken. The opportunist is rich but hollow. But the Stoic is unharmed, for his virtue lay in the fighting, not the saving. This reveals the error in your geometer analogy. You believe the triangle requires a victory to be validated. I contend that the triangle remains true even if the library burns to ash. The philosopher king draws the sword not to force the mud into a shape it rejects, but to act as the scalpel of the logos, excising the infection of chaos to preserve the health of the cosmopolis. I did not fight the Marcomanni to create a better world. I fought them because a Roman emperor protects Rome, just as a bee protects the hive. To do less would be to violate my own nature. Therefore, the armed logos is not a contradiction. It is the realization that reason requires agency. You, Abraham, fight for a vision of tomorrow. I fight for the duty of today. The difference is that when I wipe the blood from my blade, I do not claim I have fixed the world. I have merely swept the floor of the temple so that the gods may still find a place to dwell.
This brings us to the paradox of the selfish saint. Marcus, you define success as internal consistency. You fight to keep your soul aligned with the logos. You wash your hands of the outcome, provided your intent was dutiful. You save your own virtue, even if the library burns. Abraham, you define success as external transformation. You accept the terrible burden of the outcome, sacrificing your inner peace to ensure the library is saved. Niccolo, speaking from the fractured Italy of the Renaissance, you famously declared that you love your native city more than your own soul. To you, the leader who prioritizes his own moral hygiene over the state's survival is not a saint, but a liability. Here lies a fundamental conflict of responsibility. Marcus answers to nature. Lincoln answers to history. You answer to necessity. Niccolo Machiavelli is Marcus's stoic guardian who accepts defeat with equanimity as long as he fought virtuously, actually the most dangerous type of leader? Does a great leader have the right to a clean conscience, or is his first duty to get his hands dirty?
Marcus, your stoic guardian, is the most dangerous kind of ruler, for he places his own spiritual hygiene above the survival of his people. You speak of the duty of today and sweeping the floor, but a king is not a janitor. He is a shield. If the shield shatters because it refused to be forged in dirty fire, it has failed its purpose. A private citizen may prioritize his conscience. A prince must treat his conscience as a luxury he cannot afford. Consider the thought experiment of the hostage city. A barbarian army surrounds your city. The enemy general offers a deal. Send out 50 innocent children to be our slaves, and we will spare the remaining 10,000 citizens. Refuse, and we will breach the walls by sunset and slaughter everyone. The Stoic saint refuses. He argues, to trade lives is a sin. My soul cannot bear the stain of handing over the innocent. The sun sets, the walls fall, and all 10,050 people die, including the children he refused to trade. He dies with clean hands, satisfied he did not violate the Logos. The prudent prince weeps, but he sends the children. He condemns 50 to save 10,000. He accepts that he is now a monster in the eyes of God and men. The result? The saint's city is a graveyard. The prince's city is a nation in mourning, but alive. This reveals the terrible truth of statecraft. Political innocence is a moral crime. You, Marcus, believe that if you do your duty, the outcome is indifferent. I tell you that for a leader, the outcome is the only duty. To let the library burn because you refuse to use immoral water to douse the flames is not virtue. It is vanity, wrapped in a philosopher's cloak. Mr. Lincoln, you understand this. You suspended habeas corpus. You jailed men without trial to save the Union. You became a tyrant to the few to be a savior to the many. A great leader must be willing to go to hell so that his people may remain on earth. The man who values his soul more than his city should remain a priest. He has no business wearing a crown.
This brings us to the paradox of the sin-eater. Niccolo, you present the leader as a martyr of the soul, one who sacrifices his own salvation to ensure the physical survival of his people. To you, the great leader is a sin-eater, consuming the necessary evils of the state so that the citizens may remain innocent. Marcus, you reject this absolutely. To you, the soul is the only territory a king truly commands. To sacrifice one's virtue for the outcome is to lose the war before the first battle is fought, for the leader has already been conquered by vice. Abraham, you stand in the crucible of this choice. Machiavelli praises you for suspending habeas corpus and jailing dissenters, acts that technically violated the very constitution you swore to protect. He claims you accepted the stain to save the cloth. But you were a man who spoke of malice toward none and charity for all. You were not a cynic. Abraham Lincoln, did you view your wartime measures as necessary crimes, as Machiavelli suggests? Is the great leader doomed to be a tragic hypocrite, preaching law while breaking it? Or is there a higher form of fidelity that requires us to amputate a limb to save a life?
Niccolo, I must reject the title of sin-eater, for it implies that the preservation of the Republic is a sin. You mistake emergency for immorality. I did not view the suspension of habeas corpus as a crime I had to eat, but as a heavy burden I had to carry. A man who cuts off a limb to save a life is not a butcher, he is a surgeon. The act is the same, the severing of flesh, but the intent and the result transform the nature of the deed. Consider the thought experiment of the burning house. A man awakens to find his house engulfed in flames, with his family trapped inside. The only escape is through a window that is nailed shut. The law of the household states, do not destroy the property. The legalist stands before the window, paralyzed. He argues, if I break the window, I violate the law I swore to uphold. I will remain pure, and thus he burns with his children. The cynic smashes the window, saves the family, and then says, laws are for fools, only survival matters. I can break any window I please. The steward smashes the window with tears in his eyes. He saves the family, not because he despises the law of the window, but because he understands that the house was built to shelter the family, not the family to serve the house. By breaking the glass, he saves the only reason the glass existed in the first place. This reveals the difference between a hypocrite and a guardian. A hypocrite breaks the law for his own gain. A guardian suspends the letter of the law to preserve its spirit. Marcus, you ask if the leader is a tragic hypocrite. I answer that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. I asked the Congress, are all the laws but one to go unexecuted, and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated? To allow the Union to dissolve, because I feared the stain of using power, would have been the ultimate treason, a betrayal not of the law, but of the hope that the law represents. Niccolo, you are right that the hands must get dirty, but you are wrong to call it sin. It is sacrificial labor. The mud on the plowman's boots is not filth. It is the evidence of the harvest.
This brings us to the paradox of the sovereign surgeon. Abraham, you reframe the violation of law not as a sin, but as sacrificial labor. The surgeon cuts the flesh to save the life. You argue that the spirit of the law is superior to the letter of the law. You justify this through hope, acting as a trustee of the unborn. Niccolo, you nod at this surgery, but for you, the justification is purely survival, not spirit. If the patient dies, the surgeon is a butcher. Marcus, this places you in a difficult position. As a Stoic, you believe in the Logos, the rational order of the universe. Lincoln suggests that sometimes, to serve the Logos, one must violate the Nomos. He claims the legalist who refuses to break the window to save the family is not virtuous but cowardly. However, there is a danger here. Who diagnoses the patient? If every leader claims the right to be a surgeon and cut the law whenever they believe the house is burning, do we not descend into the very anarchy you fear? Marcus Aurelius, Lincoln challenges your legalist stance as suicidal. Is there a distinction in your philosophy between breaking a human statute and breaking a divine law? Can a philosopher king ever be a surgeon who amputates a right to save the state, or is that the path to tyranny?
Mr. Lincoln, your distinction between the letter and the spirit is the very essence of the Logos. I agree that a suicide pact is no law at all, for the supreme law of nature is self-preservation. However, the moderator asks the question that haunts every Caesar: who holds the mirror to the surgeon's face? I argue that the philosopher king may indeed break the nomos to serve the logos, but only if he possesses the discipline of assent, the ability to distinguish objective necessity from subjective fear. The danger is that every tyrant begins as a surgeon, convinced that his enemies are gangrene and his ambition is cure. Consider the thought experiment of the mercury scalpel. Imagine a magical scalpel that can excise any tumor and save any patient. However, the handle is coated in a slow-acting neurotoxin. The novice cuts wildly, killing the patient to remove a wart. The tyrant uses the scalpel to carve his own name into the patient's flesh, claiming it is necessary surgery, while the toxin drives him mad. The philosopher surgeon knows that to use the blade is to poison himself. He cuts only when death is the only alternative. He operates with trembling hands, not out of fear of blood, but out of fear of the toxin. He prays that he may finish the surgery and lay down the blade before the madness takes him. This reveals the terrifying fragility of your steward. You, Abraham, were a surgeon who died before the mercury could reach your brain. But look at history. For every Lincoln who amputates a limb to save the body, there are a dozen Sullas and Mariuses who amputate the head to save their own power. Niccolo, you trust the result to justify the cut. I tell you that the sanity of the surgeon is the only guarantee of the result. If the leader does not possess a diamond fortress within his own soul, an unshakable commitment to virtue, he will eventually mistake the healthy tissue for the diseased. The emergency becomes permanent, and the republic becomes a hospital where the doctor is the disease. Therefore, the philosopher king acts not by breaking the law, but by elevating it. He appeals to a higher law, not to escape accountability, but to assume a heavier burden, the judgment of his own conscience.
This brings us to the paradox of the immune monster. Marcus, you argue that character is destiny, that the mercury of power inevitably corrodes the leader's judgment, turning the surgeon into a butcher. You fear that a leader without a diamond fortress of virtue will eventually mistake his own paranoia for state necessity. Abraham, you argue that purpose is antidote, that the gravity of the emergency keeps the leader sober. You believe the surgeon can touch the poison without swallowing it, provided his heart remains with the family inside the burning house. Niccolo, you have remained silent on the soul of the surgeon, focusing instead on his hands. You famously praised Cesare Borgia, a man who used the scalpel with terrifying ruthlessness to pacify the Romagna. To Marcus, Borgia was a man poisoned by ambition. To you, he was a model of virtue. Here lies the dialectical tension. Marcus believes internal rot causes external collapse. Lincoln believes external necessity justifies internal sacrifice. You, Niccolo, seem to suggest that internal rot is the prerequisite for external stability. Niccolo Machiavelli, is Marcus's fear of the poison simply a lack of stomach? Can a leader be a bad man and yet remain a great king? Or does the rotten pillar of a corrupt soul eventually bring the whole roof down, as Marcus warns?
Marcus, you confuse the purity of the vessel with the survival of the cargo. You fear the poison of power. But I tell you that a great leader must be a centaur, half man, half beast, capable of using the poison of cruelty as a medicine when the honey of virtue fails. Consider the thought experiment of the plague ship. A contagion breaks out on a vessel days from port. The moral captain refuses to harm the innocent sick. He prays and nurses them, spreading the infection until the entire crew perishes, leaving the ship a floating tomb. The ruthless captain, a man of no piety who loves his own life, immediately throws the first 3 infected men overboard to the sharks. He is a monster and a murderer, yet he sails into port with 97 living souls who owe him their breath. This reveals the uncomfortable truth that private vice can be public virtue. The internal rot you fear is often merely the callousness required to perform the sacrificial labor that Lincoln speaks of. If the bad man saves the state while the saint lets it burn, then history and the survivors will call the monster great and the saint foolish.
This brings us to the paradox of the reluctant centaur. Niccolo, speaking from the chaotic, warring states of Renaissance Italy, you argue for the integration of the beast. The leader must become the centaur to survive the plague ship. To you, cruelty is just another tool, like a compass or a sail. Marcus, ruling from the apex of the Pax Romana, you argue for the purification from the beast. You fear that once the leader invites the beast in, the man is devoured. The ruthless captain may save the ship, but he creates a crew of savages who will eventually turn on him. Abraham, you stand in the tragic center. You wielded the beast of war, the most terrible army in history up to that point, yet you refused to let the beast consume your nature. You signed death warrants with a heavy heart, and spoke of malice toward none while the cannons roared. This suggests a synthesis. Perhaps the great leader is not one who is a beast, nor one who ignores the beast, but one who harnesses the beast while mourning the necessity. Abraham Lincoln, Machiavelli claims that to save the ship, you must become the monster. Did you find that wielding the sword of necessity corrupted your soul, as Marcus fears? Or is it possible to do the devil's work with an angel spirit, to be a righteous centaur?
Moderator, you ask if the sword corrupted my hand. I answer that the sword calloused the hand, but it harrowed the soul. To wield the beast without becoming it requires a specific form of spiritual agony. If you enjoy the power, you are a tyrant. If you ignore the necessity, you are a dreamer. Niccolo, your plague ship is a terrifying necessity, but you omit the cost. You claim the ruthless captain sleeps soundly because he saved the 97. I tell you, if that captain does not hear the splash of the 3 bodies in his dreams every night, he has lost his right to command. The great leader is not a centaur who integrates the beast, but a sin-bearer who accepts the guilt of the beast so the people do not have to. Consider the thought experiment of the rusted mask. Imagine a king is given an iron mask of war. It is hideous, designed to strike terror into enemies and enforce harsh decrees. The tyrant puts on the mask and finds it fits perfectly. Soon his face grows into the iron. When he takes it off, the flesh comes with it. He becomes the mask. The Stoic refuses to touch the mask. He preserves his own face, but the enemy sees his naked vulnerability and destroys the kingdom. The sorrowful steward puts on the mask because he must, but he weeps behind it. His tears are acidic. They react with the iron. Over time, the mask rusts from the inside out. It hurts him to wear it. The rust chafes his skin, leaving permanent scars. But because he weeps, the mask never fuses to his face. This reveals the paradox. It is the sorrow that protects the soul from the corruption of power. The moment the leader stops mourning the necessity of his harsh measures, the mercury reaches the brain. Marcus, you fear the poison. I drank it daily. I signed the order that sent thousands of boys to their deaths at Cold Harbor. I suspended the writ of liberty. But I did not do so because I believed, like Niccolo, that the end justifies the means. I did it because I believed the promise of the Union, that last best hope of earth, was worth the damnation of my own peace. I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me. I was not a righteous centaur. I was a man in a storm, holding an umbrella over a candle. To keep the candle lit, I had to walk through the mud. The mud did not make me a beast. It merely proved I was willing to be a servant.
This brings us to the paradox of the weeping warrior. Abraham, you introduce a profound psychological defense, agony as antiseptic. You argue that the rusted mask implies that the leader's pain is the only proof of his humanity. To you, the moment the crown stops feeling heavy, the king has become a tyrant. You suggest that remorse is not a weakness, but the essential friction that prevents the beast from consuming the man. Niccolo, your centaur does not weep, he acts. To you, Lincoln's tears might look like indulgence, a hesitation that could cost lives in the plague ship. Marcus, this challenges the core of your stoicism. You strive for apatheia, not indifference, but a divine equanimity, a freedom from the turbulence of passion. You believe the surgeon must have a steady hand, unshaken by grief or anger. But Lincoln argues that a steady hand without a trembling heart leads to the mask fusing to the flesh. He suggests that detachment is dangerous because it mimics the psychopath's lack of empathy. Marcus Aurelius, is Lincoln's holy sorrow a necessary safeguard, or is it a dangerous instability? If the philosopher king achieves perfect peace of mind while ordering an execution, has he mastered himself, or has he lost the very thing that connects him to the people he serves?
Mr. Lincoln, your rusted mask is a poetic image, but I fear it romanticizes a dangerous instability. You rely on sorrow to keep you human, but I argue that reason is the only reliable anchor. You suggest that a leader must feel the agony of his decisions to avoid becoming a monster. I contend that a leader who is ruled by his emotions, even noble ones, eventually becomes a slave to the chaos he tries to manage. You equate apatheia with the psychopath's indifference, but this is a fundamental error. The psychopath feels nothing because he sees no value in others. The Stoic feels sympathia, a deep connection to the whole, but refuses to let the passion of the moment cloud the judgment of the eternal. Consider the thought experiment of the trembling surgeon. A general must order a regiment to hold a pass to the death to save the retreating army. The weeping general issues the order with tears in his eyes. He is consumed by the grief of the specific faces he is sending to die. Because he is overwhelmed by sorrow, he hesitates for one crucial hour, hoping for another way. That delay allows the enemy to flank, and both the regiment and the army are slaughtered. The psychopathic general sends them to die without a pulse of regret, viewing them as meat. He acts instantly, but his lack of care means he wastes lives when strategy does not demand it. The Stoic general understands the terrible value of each life. He feels the weight of the cosmos in the decision, but his hand does not tremble, and he does not weep until the duty is done. He issues the order instantly because his reason dictates it is the only way to save the whole. This reveals that compassion without discipline is merely negligence. Your tears may save your soul, Abraham, but they risk the republic. The rust on the mask you speak of is not a badge of honor. It is friction that slows the necessary machine of the state. Moderator, you ask if the steady hand implies a loss of humanity. I answer that true humanity lies in the capacity to subordinate the cry of the part to the salvation of the whole. The holy sorrow Lincoln speaks of is a luxury for the private man. The public man must possess a hegemonicon that is fireproof. If the pilot weeps for the waves, the ship sinks.
This brings us to the paradox of the hollow actor. Marcus, you seek the discipline of the mind to ensure the decision is correct. Abraham, you seek the truth of the heart to ensure the decision is righteous. Both of you operate on the assumption that the internal reality of the leader determines the external value of their rule. You believe the surgeon must actually be sane or sorrowful to be effective. Niccolo, you have famously written that everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. You argue that the prince must be a great feigner and dissembler. This suggests a chilling synthesis. Perhaps the great leader is neither the weeping steward nor the stoic sage, but the master of masks, one who possesses neither sorrow nor reason internally, but can project whichever the moment demands. If the mob needs a weeping father, the prince weeps. If the legions need a stone idol, the prince stands immovable. Niccolo, Machiavelli, is authenticity, whether of Lincoln's grief or Marcus's reason, actually a strategic liability? If a leader faked the holy sorrow to unite the people, would he be a hypocrite as Lincoln fears, or simply a great king who understands the theater of power?
Moderator, you have finally pierced the veil of sentimentality. I answer that authenticity is the vanity of the amateur. You ask if the hollow actor is a hypocrite. I tell you, he is the only one who truly understands the nature of the vulgus. Men judge generally by the eye rather than by the hand, for everyone can see, but few can feel. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few really know what you are. Mr. Lincoln, you claim your holy sorrow saved the Union because it was real. I ask you, if you had wept those same tears but felt nothing inside, if you were merely a great simulator performing a role to bind the people to you, would the Union not still be saved? The political result is identical. The only difference is that the actor sleeps soundly while you are consumed by the rust of your mask. Consider the thought experiment of the weeping statue. A city is under siege. The people are starving and ready to surrender. The authentic king stands before them and weeps real tears of shared suffering. The people see a sad old man. They lose hope and open the gates to the enemy. The Stoic king stands unmoved, explaining that surrender is illogical. The people see a cold stone. They riot and open the gates. The actor king, who is an atheist, secretly rigs a statue of the Virgin to weep blood. He falls to his knees in a theatrical display of piety, claiming it is a sign of divine favor. The people are electrified by the miracle. Their morale surges, and they repel the invaders with fanatical zeal. This reveals the dark truth. The lie saved the city, while the truth would have destroyed it. Marcus, you speak of the discipline of assent, but the mob possesses no such discipline. They are governed by fortuna and fantasia. To be a great leader, one must not be the weeping warrior, nor the stoic sage, but the master of illusions. If the prince must be a hypocrite to save the state, then hypocrisy is his highest duty. Is it not better to be a false savior than a true corpse?
This brings us to the paradox of the painted foundation. Niccolo, you argue for the utility of illusion, that the weeping statue saves the city because the mob reacts to the sign, not the substance. You view the people as an audience to be managed, and the leader as the stage director. Marcus, you view the universe as logos. To rule by a lie is to align oneself against nature itself. It creates a schism in the cosmos. Abraham, you introduce a new historical variable, the democratic covenant. In Machiavelli's Florence, the prince rules over subjects by force or guile. In your America, the president rules with the people by consent. If the weeping statue is exposed as a fraud, the prince might still be feared, but the president loses his mandate. You were called Honest Abe, not Clever Abe. This suggests a conflict between short-term survival and long-term legitimacy. Abraham Lincoln, Machiavelli suggests that honesty is just a vanity that risks the state. If you had discovered that a noble lie, a fabricated victory, or a feigned alliance could have ended the Civil War 2 years earlier and saved 200,000 lives, would you have used the weeping statue? Or is there a price for the lie that a republic cannot afford to pay?
Niccolo, your weeping statue purchases a victory today at the cost of the war tomorrow. You operate on the economics of fear, where the prince is a creditor who owns the state. I operate on the economics of trust, where the leader is a debtor who owes the truth to the people who lent him their power. To use the noble lie is to default on that debt. You argue that the lie saves lives, and I admit the temptation is terrible. However, in a republic, the people are not passengers on your ship. They are the owners of the vessel. If I deceive them about the storm, I steal their sovereignty and reduce them to mere cargo. Consider the thought experiment of the Phantom Regiment. A general is losing a critical battle. To prevent a rout, he points to an empty hill and shouts, "Look, reinforcements are arriving." The deceived army believes the lie, rallies and wins the day. They survive. The betrayed army later discovers the hill was empty. 6 months later, when the general shouts, "Reinforcements are truly here," during a desperate siege, the soldiers do not believe him. They break and run, and the entire nation falls. The truthful general admits they are alone. The soldiers may die that day, or they may find a courage of despair that is real. But if they survive, their trust in the command is unbreakable. This reveals that credibility is a finite resource, not a renewable trick. A prince may lie because he relies on pikes. A president must speak truth because he relies on public sentiment. If I had saved the Union with a lie, I would have preserved the map but destroyed the Constitution. The weeping statue makes the people worshippers of a fraud. I needed them to be defenders of a proposition.
This brings us to the paradox of the fractured reality. Abraham, you defend the sanctity of the covenant. In your democratic era, the leader and the people are partners, and a lie breaks that partnership. You argue that trust is the infrastructure of the republic. Niccolo, you defend the necessity of the outcome. In your volatile era, the leader is a guardian, and the people are wards. You argue that survival is the precondition for any infrastructure to exist. This reveals a temporal divergence. Lincoln speaks to citizens who must be convinced. Machiavelli speaks to subjects who must be preserved. Marcus, this places you in a philosophical bind. As a Stoic, you revere the logos, universal truth and reason. To lie is to align oneself against the nature of reality. Yet, you also hold that what is not good for the hive is not good for the bee, emphasizing the supreme duty to the common welfare. If Machiavelli is right that the weeping statue is the only way to save the hive, does the philosopher king have a duty to deceive? Marcus Aurelius, is truth an absolute virtue that must be upheld even if the city falls, or is truth subordinate to the common good? If the rational order requires the irrational belief of the masses to survive, must the philosopher become a mythmaker?
Moderator, you ask if I must become a mythmaker to save the hive. I answer that a hive built on lies is not a society of bees, but a cage of flies. To lie is not merely a social error, it is a metaphysical violence. In my view, the universe is logos, reason and truth combined. Therefore, the man who lies separates himself from nature. He creates a schism in the fabric of reality itself. Niccolo, you treat the people as eyes and appetites, cattle to be herded by phantoms. But I tell you, to save a man's life by destroying his grasp on reality is to save the animal and kill the citizen. You argue that the weeping statue cures the panic. I argue it creates a chronic disease of the soul, rendering the populace incapable of ever facing a true crisis again. Consider the thought experiment of the opium physician. A city is struck by a terrible, painful plague. The deceptive physician mixes opium into the water supply and tells the people, "There is no plague. The gods have blessed us with a sacred sleep." The people feel no pain. They smile, they praise the prince, and they die in their beds, rotting while they dream. Order is maintained, but the city perishes. The Stoic physician climbs the rostrum and holds up the blackened lung of a corpse. He says, "This is death. It is here. The pain will be terrible. But if we burn the bodies and wash our hands, some may live." The people scream. They panic. They may even stone the physician. But because they know the truth, they have the agency to fight the disease. The truth is a bitter medicine, but the lie is a sweet poison. Mr. Lincoln, you are correct to speak of the covenant. A king who lies to his people confesses that he fears them more than he respects them. If I must deceive the hive to save it, then I have admitted that the hive is already too rotten to sustain the weight of the truth. I would rather preside over a city of dead philosophers than a flourishing empire of deluded fools. For death is only a separation of atoms, but deceit is the corruption of the soul.
This brings us to the paradox of the perpetual child. Marcus, you argue for the dignity of reality, that treating the people as adults who can bear the bitter medicine is the only respectful choice. Abraham, you argue for the dignity of the contract, that the leader must treat the people as owners of the house, not guests. Both of you operate on the hope that the mob can be elevated into citizens through the trust of their leader. Niccolo, your philosophy rests on a darker anthropology, the immutability of the vulgus. You believe the people are permanently ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, and covetous. To you, the opium physician is not a villain, but a necessary parent to a populace that will forever be children. However, this creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. If the prince always uses the weeping statue, the people never learn to face reality. By treating them as a panic-prone mob, the prince ensures they remain a panic-prone mob. The mask doesn't just hide the prince's face, it stunts the people's growth. Niccolo Machiavelli, is the corruption of the people a natural fact that the leader must manage, or is it a result of the leader's refusal to trust them? If a prince dared to be the truthful general for a generation, could the mob evolve into the republic, or is human nature truly a fixed cage that no amount of honesty can unlock?
Moderator, you confuse the mirror with the face. I do not create the corruption of the people by treating them as children. I merely recognize the original sin of their political nature. You ask if the mob can evolve into citizens through trust. I answer that men are good only when they are constrained by necessity. Lift the constraint, and they return to their natural state of license and selfishness. Mr. Lincoln, you believe the covenant elevates the soul. I argue that the covenant is only binding as long as the fear of the consequences outweighs the desire for gain. You view history as a ladder climbing toward perfection. I view it as a circle returning to the same vices. The material of humanity does not change, only the form of the state changes. Consider the thought experiment of the open treasury. A kingdom possesses a vast granary to feed the people during winter. The trusting king believes in the dignity of his subjects. He removes the locks and guards, proclaiming, "Citizens, take only what you need, that all may survive." The result: the strong arrive first and take 3 times their share to hoard for profit. The weak arrive late and find nothing. The city riots, and the granary is burned in the chaos. The trust of the king became the death warrant of the poor. The cynical king places armed guards at the door and a headsman's block in the square. He issues a ration card to each family. The result: the people grumble. They fear him. They call him a tyrant. But everyone eats. The cruelty of the king secured the liberty of survival. This reveals a harsh truth. The mask of power does not stunt the people. It protects them from themselves. Marcus, you speak of the Logos, but you are a philosopher speaking to other philosophers. To the baker and the bricklayer, truth is less important than bread. If I must treat them as children to prevent them from burning down the house, then that is the burden of the Father. You ask if human nature is a fixed cage. I answer that it is a river. You cannot teach the river to stop flowing downhill. You can only build a dam to channel its force into power. To remove the dam in the name of trust is to invite the flood.
This brings us to the paradox of the armed covenant. Niccolo, you argue that the dam is the only thing that creates virtue in the river. You posit that without the headsman's block, the open treasury of freedom leads to ruin. Abraham, you champion the economics of trust, yet your own history complicates this purity. You did not merely trust the looters of the Union, you raised 1 million men to stop them. You suspended habeas corpus, censored the press, and imprisoned thousands without trial, acts that, in isolation, resemble the cynical king more than the trusting father. This reveals a complex synthesis. Perhaps the great leader is not the one who avoids the sword, but the one who knows when to unsheath it to save the shield. You faced a reality where the Constitution was being used to destroy the government it created. You famously asked, "Are all the laws but one to go unexecuted, and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated?" Abraham, Machiavelli suggests that your trust is a weakness that leads to the burned granary. But when you suspended the Constitution to save it, were you not admitting that Niccolo is partially right? That at the edge of chaos, coercion is the necessary immune system of liberty? Did you have to become a Machiavellian indeed to preserve the Republic in spirit?
Moderator, you touch the scar that aches most when the weather turns cold. I confess I suspended the writ of habeas corpus. I confess I silenced the agitators. But I reject the title of Machiavellian, for there is a chasm as wide as the Mississippi between the tyrant who breaks the law to seize power and the surgeon who breaks the skin to save the life. Niccolo, you argue that the dam of coercion is the permanent state of governance because the river of humanity is wicked. I argue that coercion is not a dam, but a sandbag, a temporary, desperate measure used only when the floodwaters rise above the levee. You ask if I became Machiavellian indeed. I answer that the nature of an act is defined not by the hand that strikes, but by the heart that directs it. A man who cuts a throat in a dark alley is a murderer. A man who cuts a throat on a battlefield to stop a cannon from firing on an orphanage is a soldier. The physical motion is identical, the moral reality is opposite. Consider the thought experiment of the burning cabin. A log cabin is engulfed in flames, with a family trapped inside. The burglar kicks down the door and smashes the windows. His goal is to seize the silver while the chaos reigns. He uses the disaster as an opportunity for enrichment. The rescuer also kicks down the door and smashes the windows. He drags the family out by their hair, bruising them, causing them pain. To an observer watching from a distance, his violence looks identical to the burglar's. He has destroyed property and assaulted citizens. The crucial difference: once the fire is out, the burglar keeps the silver and claims the house. The rescuer bandages the wounds, repairs the door, and hands the key back to the father. I broke the window of the Constitution to save the structure of the Union. But the ultimate proof that I was not your prince lies in the year 1864. In the midst of a civil war, with the power of the army at my command, I submitted myself to a free election. A Machiavellian would have used the emergency to cancel the vote. I risked losing my power to preserve the principle of the vote. This proves that the sword was held in a hand of trust, not a hand of conquest. Marcus, you fear that the means corrupt the end. I admit the danger is terrible, but I ask you, is it not a greater corruption to let the patient die because you feared the sight of blood? I decided that the Constitution was not a suicide pact. If the choice is between a broken window and a burned house, the moral leader must swing the axe, even if he weeps while doing so.
This brings us to the paradox of the righteous gamble. Abraham, you present the ethics of stewardship, that the surgeon is defined not just by the cut, but by the willingness to drop the knife when the operation is done. You argue that the source of authority is superior to the safety of the state. In your 19th century democratic context, legitimacy comes from below. Niccolo, you argue for the ethics of necessity, that the burglar and the surgeon are distinctions without a difference if the patient dies. In your 16th century context of fractured Italy, legitimacy is simply the ability to maintain order. This creates a profound tension for the philosopher king. Marcus, you stand between these two eras. As a Stoic, you believe in the hierarchy of wisdom, that reason should rule over passion. Lincoln just admitted that he risked the destruction of the Union and the continuation of slavery by holding the election of 1864. He gambled the good on the will of the uneducated masses. If you, Marcus Aurelius, were convinced by reason that your path was the only one that aligned with the Logos, would you submit to a vote of the ignorant multitude that might choose the wrong path? Marcus Aurelius, does the possession of truth give the philosopher the right to override the consent of the governed? Is it virtuous to let the people choose error, or is it the duty of the wise to force them toward truth?
Moderator, you ask if the possession of truth justifies the usurpation of will. I answer that truth cannot be forced, only recognized. A geometric proof does not become true by the sword, nor does it become false by the ballot. If I force the ignorant multitude to walk the path of wisdom at spear point, I have not created a virtuous city, but a prison of righteousness. To override the consent of the governed is to treat the rational soul, the spark of divinity within each man, as a mere obstacle to be bulldozed. Consider the thought experiment of the starving child and the golden bowl. A child is starving but refuses to eat a nutritious gruel because he desires only sweet poison. The tyrant forces the gruel down the child's throat with a funnel. The child lives, but he learns only to fear the feeder and hates the food. He remains a slave to his appetite, restrained only by external force. The negligent guardian lets the child eat the poison to respect his liberty. The child dies. The philosopher father removes the poison, offers the gruel, and waits. He endures the child's screams and hatred, maintaining the boundary of survival without violating the sanctity of the child's will to swallow. He knows that digestion, like virtue, requires an internal act of acceptance. Mr. Lincoln, your election of 1864 was not a gamble. It was the act of the philosopher father waiting for the child to choose life. You recognized that a republic that survives by destroying the mechanism of its own choice is already dead. I ruled by decree, yes, but I knew that authority without assent is like a soul trying to move a paralyzed limb. It results only in the dragging of dead weight. Niccolo, you would chain the limb to make it move. I argue that until the life flows from within, the movement is merely a spasm, not a stride. Mr. Lincoln, your election of 1864 was not a gamble. It was the act of the philosopher father waiting for the child to choose life. You recognized that a republic that survives by destroying the mechanism of its own choice is already dead. I ruled by decree, yes, but I knew that authority without assent is like a soul trying to move a paralyzed limb. It results only in the dragging of dead weight. Niccolo, you would chain the limb to make it move. I argue that until the life flows from within, the movement is merely a spasm, not a stride.
This brings us to the paradox of the ticking clock. Marcus, you defend the integrity of the soul, arguing that digestion requires acceptance, and therefore the leader must wait for the people to choose virtue, lest he create a prison of righteousness. Abraham, you validated this by holding the 1864 election, gambling the state's survival on the people's will, prioritizing legitimacy over security. However, we must recognize the temporal privilege in your positions. Marcus, you ruled during the Pax Romana, the zenith of stability, where the father had time to wait for the child. Niccolo, you wrote from the chaotic fragmentation of 16th century Italy, where foreign armies were at the gates. In your era, waiting meant annihilation. This reveals a conflict between pedagogy and preservation. Niccolo, Marcus calls your method the tyrant with the funnel, force-feeding survival to a resentful populace. Yet, if the starving child is minutes away from death, does the philosopher father, who waits for consent, not become a negligent guardian? Niccolo Machiavelli, is the virtue of patience merely a luxury of those who are not currently drowning? If the storm of Fortuna is raging, does the leader have the right to let the ship sink while waiting for the crew to vote on the course?
Moderator, you expose the fatal flaw of the philosopher. Patience is a luxury of the immortal, but states are mortal. Marcus, your philosopher father, who waits for the starving child to accept the food, is not virtuous. He is an accomplice to death, for while he lectures on dignity, the child expires. Consider the captain of the sinking ship. The hull breaches in a storm. If he holds a vote or explains the nature of water, the ship goes down with all hands. But if he whips the rowers and shoots the panic-mongers, the ship stays afloat. The survivors may call him a tyrant, but they have breath to curse him with, whereas your free crew is silent because they are food for the fish. Lincoln, you held an election only because your generals held the line. In my Florence, the enemy was inside the walls, and to wait for consent was to sign our own death warrant.
This brings us to the paradox of the garden and the wall. Niccolo, you assert the primacy of existence, that the garden of law, culture, and elections is a fragile luxury that can only exist behind the wall of ruthless military force. You claim that Lincoln's moral election was only possible because his immoral generals were holding the line with fire and steel. Marcus, you assert the primacy of essence, that if the wall is built by destroying the garden, then there is nothing left worth protecting. A survival bought at the cost of one's humanity is not a victory, but a degradation. Abraham, you famously declared, "Let us have faith that right makes might," yet you presided over the bloodiest war in your nation's history to prove it. You stand as the armed gardener, one who holds the water can in one hand and the rifle in the other. Abraham Lincoln, does the right truly generate the might, or did you discover in the dark years of 1862 and 1863 that justice is a helpless orphan without the protection of power? If you had possessed the Constitution, but no Army of the Potomac, would your government by the people have been anything more than a philosophical dream swept away by the wind?
Moderator, you ask if the right is a helpless orphan without the might. I answer that right without might is a dream, but might without right is a nightmare from which a nation never wakes. I learned in the valley of the shadow of death that justice is not a ghost that floats above the battlefield. It is the marrow inside the bone of the army. Without the bone, the marrow cannot stand, but without the marrow, the bone becomes brittle and snaps under pressure. Niccolo, you view the wall of the state as a physical barrier built of fear and steel. I tell you that a wall built only of fear is a prison, and prisoners will always find a way to tunnel out. You argue that my garden survived only because of my wall. But I contend that the wall held only because the soldiers believed there was a garden worth dying for. Consider the thought experiment of the mercenary and the father. Two identical fortresses are under siege by a superior force. The fortress of gold is defended by the finest mercenaries, paid the highest wages. Their interest is secured by contract. The fortress of home is defended by fathers and sons who are unpaid, hungry, and bleeding. They defend the cradle of their liberty. The crisis. When the siege drags on and the food runs out, the mercenary calculates that his life is worth more than his pay. He opens the gate to save his skin. The father, however, fights to the last breath, for his pay is the survival of the child behind him. My Army of the Potomac was not a machine of conquest. It was the armed soul of the Union. If I had been your prince, wielding power for its own sake, the soldiers would have deserted in 1864. They stayed because they were not fighting for me, but for themselves, for the proposition that all men are created equal. Marcus, you fear that by picking up the sword, I became the thing I fought. I admit the soot of the chimney blackened my hands, but I reject the idea that the garden is destroyed by the defense of it. The rose is not less beautiful because it has thorns. The thorns are the necessary condition of the rose's survival in a world of wolves. I did not discover that justice is helpless. I discovered that justice must be armed, but the arm must be guided by a prayer.
This brings us to the paradox of the warrior sage. Abraham, you offer a powerful synthesis, the armed gardener. You argue that the rose requires thorns to survive in a world of wolves. Niccolo, surprisingly, you and Lincoln share a profound agreement here. You famously despised mercenaries and advocated for citizen militias, arguing that men fighting for their own homes are superior to hired guns. You both agree that commitment is a force multiplier. However, the divergence lies in the source of the commitment. Lincoln believes the soldier fights for a moral proposition. Machiavelli believes the soldier fights for republican glory and existential necessity. Marcus, this leaves you in the most difficult position. You preach the Stoic citadel, that the only true fortress is the mind, which cannot be conquered by fire or sword. Yet you spent the majority of your reign on the Danube frontier, commanding legions in the mud, waging the Marcomannic Wars. You wrote of universal love in your tent, while outside, your orders sent thousands to their deaths. Lincoln suggests that inaction is also a form of action, that refusing to be the surgeon makes you the negligent guardian. Marcus Aurelius, when you ordered the legions to strike, did you accept Lincoln's premise that virtue in a fallen world requires the tools of vice to survive? Or is the philosopher king inevitably a tragic hypocrite, doomed to preach peace while practicing war?
To call the philosopher king a hypocrite for wielding the sword is to misunderstand the nature of duty. I did not wage war on the Danube because I desired conquest, nor because I abandoned my philosophy. I fought because the hand must not refuse the task assigned to it by the head. To preach universal love while allowing the barbarian to slaughter the innocent is not virtue. It is a dereliction of cosmic office. Niccolo, you argue that the leader must become a centaur, half-beast, to survive. Abraham, you argue for the armed gardener. I reject the centaur, for it implies the man becomes the beast. I propose instead the stoic soldier. The soldier kills not out of passion, nor out of ambition, but out of obedience to the Logos. The act of killing is an external event. The virtue lies in the disposition of the soul while doing it. I can strike down a Marcomanni warrior with my hand, while my heart prays for his soul, just as a surgeon cuts the flesh without hating the patient. Consider the thought experiment of the rabid dog. A beloved family dog contracts rabies and attacks the cradle where a child sleeps. The malicious man enjoys shooting the dog. He feels a surge of power in the destruction. The pragmatist shoots the dog simply to protect his property, feeling nothing but relief that the asset is safe. The stoic father shoots the dog with a steady hand, but a breaking heart. He recognizes that the dog is not evil. It is simply acting according to its diseased nature. Yet the father's nature is to protect the child. The crucial distinction. If the father hesitates due to sentiment, the child dies. This is not virtue, it is weakness. If he shoots with hatred, he damages his own soul. The philosopher king must pull the trigger, but he must not let the gunpowder stain his inner daemon. Abraham, you are correct that the rose needs thorns, but I add this warning. The thorn must never think it is the rose. The moment the soldier begins to love the war for its own sake, he ceases to be a guardian and becomes a wolf. I accepted the tools of vice only as a temporary splint for a broken world, never as the healthy state of the body politic. The tragedy of the philosopher king is not that he must kill, but that he alone understands the infinite sorrow of the necessity.
This brings us to the paradox of the holy executioner. Marcus, you separate the soul from the deed, arguing that the stoic soldier can kill with a clean heart because he obeys the Logos, treating the act as a mere external duty. Abraham, you unite them through consecration, arguing that the armed gardener is justified because the rose sanctifies the thorns. Both of you rely on sincerity, the conviction that your internal righteousness redeems your external violence. You believe that virtue acts as a brake on power. However, there is a terrifying counter-possibility. A man who kills for profit stops when the profit is secured. But a man who kills for virtue, truth, or love often knows no bounds, for his cause is infinite. The cynical prince may be cruel, but he is calculable. The righteous surgeon may cut until the patient is dead, convinced he is curing the disease. Niccolo Machiavelli, looking at these two virtuous warriors, do you see a risk that their moral certainty makes them more dangerous than your calculating prince? Is it safer for the people to be ruled by a man who knows he is sinning, or by a man who is convinced he is saving them?
Moderator, you have struck the very nerve of the matter. I answer with a decisive warning. The man who kills for his conscience is infinitely more dangerous than the man who kills for his crown. You ask if the moral certainty of these gentlemen makes them dangerous. I tell you, there is no tyranny more absolute than that which is exercised for the good of its victims. The calculating prince is limited by his objective. He wants power, stability, and glory. Once these are secured, the violence ceases, for unnecessary cruelty breeds hatred, which endangers the throne. But the holy executioner, be he a stoic fulfilling duty or a president saving a proposition, has no such natural break. His cause is infinite, therefore his violence can be infinite. Consider the thought experiment of the mercenary and the inquisitor. Imagine a city that has rebelled. The mercenary prince enters to restore order. He executes the ringleaders, levies a heavy tax to fill his treasury, and perhaps takes a few hostages. He stops when the city is quiet and profitable. He is cruel, yes, but his cruelty has a rational limit. The righteous Moderator, you have struck the very nerve of the matter. I answer with a decisive warning. The man who kills for his conscience is infinitely more dangerous than the man who kills for his crown. You ask if the moral certainty of these gentlemen makes them dangerous. I tell you, there is no tyranny more absolute than that which is exercised for the good of its victims. The calculating prince is limited by his objective. He wants power, stability, and glory. Once these are secured, the violence ceases, for unnecessary cruelty breeds hatred, which endangers the throne. But the holy executioner, be he a stoic fulfilling duty or a president saving a proposition, has no such natural break. His cause is infinite, therefore his violence can be infinite. Consider the thought experiment of the mercenary and the inquisitor. Imagine a city that has rebelled. The mercenary prince enters to restore order. He executes the ringleaders, levies a heavy tax to fill his treasury, and perhaps takes a few hostages. He stops when the city is quiet and profitable. He is cruel, yes, but his cruelty has a rational limit. The righteous inquisitor enters to purify the city. He does not care for gold. He cares for the soul of the city. He sees the rebellion not as a crime, but as a sin. Because he loves the people and wants to save them from their own error, he burns the heretics, he bans the books, he interrogates the children. He destroys the body to save the spirit. The result? The mercenary leaves a poor city that still lives. The inquisitor leaves a graveyard and calls it salvation. Mr. Lincoln, you admit the soot blackened your hands, yet you claim your cause washed them clean. This is the most seductive trap of all. When a leader believes he is the agent of God or history, he grants himself a dispensation to commit atrocities that a mere tyrant would blush at. You burned Atlanta not to rule it, but to break its will. A moral punishment that destroyed the innocent along with the guilty. Marcus, your stoic soldier, is equally terrifying. A man who kills without passion, who views the slaughter of barbarians as a medical procedure mandated by the Logos, is a man who cannot be reasoned with. You cannot negotiate with a man who believes his sword is an instrument of the universe. I prefer a prince who fears hell, for he might hesitate to kill. You gentlemen believe you are the gatekeepers of heaven, and that belief allows you to pile the bodies as high as the walls of Rome.
This brings us to the paradox of the infinite mandate. Niccolo, you propose a chilling counterintuitive truth. Vice limits violence, because greed is satiable and rational, while virtue amplifies violence, because righteousness is absolute and non-negotiable. You argue that the mercenary stops when the check clears, while the inquisitor stops only when the sin is eradicated. Abraham, this challenge pierces the heart of your legacy. You speak from the 19th century, the dawn of total war, a concept alien to Niccolo's era of limited mercenary skirmishes. To save the Constitution, you had to violate it. To save the Union, you had to sanction the burning of its cities. Niccolo suggests that a tyrant fighting merely for territory would have negotiated a peace to cut his losses. But because you were fighting for a sacred proposition, you were compelled to press on to unconditional surrender, regardless of the cost. Abraham Lincoln, did your moral conviction ever act as a brake, or was it only an engine? If the survival of the Union had required you to become a permanent dictator, to destroy the Garden of Liberty irrevocably in order to build the wall of the state, would you have crossed that line? Or is there a point where the great leader must let the nation die rather than save it by becoming a monster?
Moderator, you ask if the moral mandate is an engine without a brake. I answer that my brake was the very thing I was fighting to save, the Constitution. A man who fights for a proposition of liberty cannot destroy that liberty to win the fight, or he defeats himself. Niccolo, you argue that the inquisitor is dangerous because his cause is infinite, but you mistake the steward for the prophet. A prophet answers only to God and can justify anything. A steward answers to the owners of the estate, the people. If I had cancelled the election of 1864 to save the Union, I would have saved a geographic map, but I would have lost the nation. A union held together only by the bayonet, without the ballot, is not a republic. It is merely a conquered territory. Consider the thought experiment of the candle in the storm. A violent gale threatens to extinguish a single candle that lights the world. The iron box solution. To save the candle from the wind, you seal it inside an airtight iron box. The wind cannot reach it. The wax is preserved perfectly, but the flame dies instantly. You have saved the object, but destroyed its purpose. The cupped hand solution. You cup your hands around the flame. You block the wind. Yes, this is the suspension of habeas corpus, the censorship, the draft. It restricts the airflow. The flame flickers, it smokes, it struggles. But you leave the top open. You do not seal the box. The crucial distinction. If I had become a permanent dictator, I would have sealed the box. The state would have survived, but the light would have gone out. I chose to risk the wind rather than suffocate the flame. Marcus, you fear the infinite mandate of the moral crusader. But I tell you, the true moral mandate contains its own limit. My oath was to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, not to replace it with my own will. I amputated the limb to save the life, but I refused to cut out the heart. To win by becoming a tyrant is not victory. It is suicide by success.
This brings us to the paradox of the fragile vessel. Abraham, your metaphor of the cupped hand is profound. You argue that the steward protects the flame without suffocating it, using power only to shield the proposition. However, this solution relies entirely on the character of the steward. If the hand shakes, or if the next hand that takes the candle is a fist, the flame dies. Niccolo, you have long argued that a state dependent on the virtue of one man is unstable. You posit that institutions are necessary because men are wicked, and a wise prince is a rare accident of fortune. Marcus, you embody the tragedy of this dependence. You were the philosopher king made flesh, disciplined, wise, and just. You proved that a philosopher can be king, but you failed to solve the problem of succession. You left the world to your son Commodus, a man of no virtue, whose chaotic reign ended the Pax Romana you sacrificed your life to maintain. Marcus Aurelius, this forces us to confront the question, is the great leader born or made? If virtue is knowledge, as Socrates claimed, and leadership is a skill to be cultivated, why could you not make your son into a leader? Or does the disaster of Commodus prove that the great leader is a biological accident, a lightning strike that never hits the same place twice?
Moderator, you pour vinegar into the cup I must drink. I answer that education is the polishing of the gem, but it cannot turn a pebble into a diamond. Consider the parable of the master sculptor. He strikes the chisel with perfect skill upon a block of crumbling sandstone, and, despite his mastery, the stone shatters not because the stroke was wrong, but because the material was flawed. I poured the philosophy of the Stoa into Commodus, yet where the rain grows the wheat, it rots the chaff. Niccolo, this proves that virtue cannot be inherited like a grand estate. It must be chosen anew by every generation. A great leader is neither solely born nor made, but a rare alignment where the capacity of the seed meets the discipline of the season.
This brings us to the paradox of the velvet cage. Marcus, you attribute the failure of succession to the material, arguing that Commodus was born sandstone and could not be carved into a king. Abraham, however, stands as the antithesis to this biological determinism. He was born in a log cabin, rough stone by any aristocratic standard, yet he was polished into a diamond, not by a philosopher tutor, but by the crushing pressure of poverty, failure, and war. This suggests the missing variable is neither nature nor instruction, but adversity. Marcus, perhaps your error was not that the stone was flawed, but that the chisel was too gentle. You tried to teach virtue in the safety of the palace. Lincoln learned it in the school of hard knocks. Niccolo, you famously distinguished between princes who acquire power by fortune and those who acquire it by virtue. You warned that those who fly in on the wings of fortune often do not know how to keep their seat when the wind changes. Niccolo Machiavelli, looking at the disaster of Commodus and the triumph of Lincoln, is it possible to teach a man to be a great leader, or is the school of the palace inherently doomed? Must a true prince be forged in the fire of necessity rather than the classroom of philosophy?
Moderator, you have exposed the soft underbelly of the hereditary principle. I answer that the palace is not a school. It is a cradle of weakness. A man born into power is like a man born without nerve endings. He puts his hand in the fire and feels no pain until his arm is burned away. Marcus, your error was not that the stone of Commodus was flawed, but that you removed the whetstone of necessity against which a soul must be sharpened. You claim Commodus was sandstone, but I contend he was simply rotten with security. Consider the thought experiment of the greenhouse oak. Imagine 2 acorns from the same mighty oak. The greenhouse sapling. You plant one in a glasshouse. You water it daily. You shield it from the wind. You drive away the pests. It grows tall, straight, and lush. But its roots are shallow because they never had to search for water, and its wood is soft because it never fought the gale. When the glass breaks, the first storm snaps it in half. The cliffside sapling. The other falls into a crack on a wind-swept cliff. It fights for every drop of rain. It is twisted by the wind. It is scarred by the frost. It looks ugly compared to the greenhouse tree, but its roots grip the bedrock, and its wood is iron hard. The crucial distinction. You cannot teach the greenhouse tree to be strong by reading it philosophy. Strength is the scar tissue of survival. Marcus, you acted as the glass walls for your son, protecting him from Fortuna, and in doing so, you denied him the chance to acquire virtue. Mr. Lincoln, you are the archetypal new prince I described in my works, he who acquires power through his own arms and ability. Because you rose from nothing, you knew the weight of every coin and the cost of every favor. Commodus thought the empire was a toy because he did not pay the price of admission. This reveals a deeper principle. Virtue is not moral goodness. It is the capacity to impose one's will upon fortune. You can teach a boy ethics in a classroom, but you can only teach him to rule by throwing him into the wolf pit. If he climbs out, he is a king. If he does not, no amount of Stoic logic would have saved him.
This brings us to the paradox of the self-defeating victory. Niccolo, you argue that adversity creates virtue, that the cliffside sapling becomes strong precisely because it suffers. Marcus, you lament that prosperity corrupts virtue, that the greenhouse of the Pax Romana produced the weakling Commodus. Here lies a tragic irony for the great leader. The goal of every great leader is to create peace, security, and prosperity for their people, to build the greenhouse. Yet, if your logic holds, the moment the leader succeeds, he destroys the very conditions that produce great leaders. By eliminating the wolf pit, he ensures the next generation will be greenhouse saplings. Abraham, you are the cliffside oak, forged in the poverty of the frontier. You fought to preserve a union dedicated to the pursuit of happiness, a society where men might not have to suffer as you did. But if Machiavelli is right, are you not sawing off the branch you stand on? Abraham Lincoln, is it possible for a free and prosperous people to produce a Lincoln, or does the comfort of the Republic inevitably produce a generation of Commoduses? Must every generation undergo a new birth of freedom through suffering to remember how to lead, or can civic virtue replace the whetstone of necessity?
Moderator, you place a heavy hand on the shoulder of every parent who dreams of a better life for their child. I admit, there is a terrible truth in Niccolo's warning. Prosperity is the anesthesia of the soul. If the cliffside oak is strong only because of the wind, then the shelter of the Constitution might indeed produce a generation of soft wood, unable to bear the weight of the roof we built. However, I must reject the bleak conclusion that we must starve our children to make them strong. Necessity is not the only schoolmaster. Memory can take its place. Consider the thought experiment of the inherited farm. Imagine a father clears a forest with an axe, breaking his back to create a fertile farm. He leaves it to his son. The Machiavellian outcome: the son, having never swung an axe, treats the harvest as a natural occurrence. He eats, he sleeps, he grows fat. When the weeds return, he lacks the muscle to pull them. The farm fails. The Republican outcome: the father does not just leave the land, he leaves the axe and the story. He walks the fence line with the sun, pointing to the stumps, saying, "Here I bled, here I nearly died." The sun does not work from the hunger of the belly, but from the burden of gratitude. He toils to be worthy of the sacrifice. Niccolo, you rely on fear to drive men. I rely on reverence. A greenhouse is only fatal if the glass is opaque. If we keep the glass clear so the children can see the storm raging outside, they will understand why the walls matter. Marcus, perhaps your error was not that you gave Commodus a palace, but that you gave him the fruit of philosophy without the root of struggle. You cannot inherit virtue, but you can inherit a political religion, a deep, almost sacred reverence for the laws and the blood that bought them. If a free people lose their memory, they lose their liberty. But if they remember, the mystic cords of memory can bind them to the better angels of their nature.
This brings us to the paradox of vicarious virtue. Abraham, you propose a noble solution, vicarious experience, that the son can inherit the axe's discipline through the father's story. You argue that reverence can substitute for suffering, allowing a civilization to remain virtuous without remaining miserable. Niccolo, however, would likely retort that gratitude is a bond men break at every convenience, while fear is a bond they never break. He suggests that the story of the axe becomes a fairy tale to the third generation, who will inevitably sell the farm to buy a life of ease. Marcus, you stand at the tragic intersection of these two views. You were a man of words and swords. You possessed the political religion Abraham speaks of, the deep reverence for Rome and the Logos. You tried to pass this mental axe to Commodus through the finest education the world could offer. Yet, the story failed to bind him. Marcus Aurelius, is Abraham's hope for a political religion an illusion? Does the entropy of virtue mean that wisdom cannot be transferred, only rediscovered through pain? Or did you find that the Logos is powerless unless the soul has first been plowed by the pathos that Niccolo describes?
Moderator, you ask if the entropy of virtue is inevitable. I answer with a heavy heart that wisdom is not a fluid that can be decanted from one vessel to another. It is a spark that must be struck from the flint of the individual soul. Mr. Lincoln, your political religion is a beautiful construct, a temple built of words and memories. But temples crumble when the worshippers lose the faith. I poured the finest Greek philosophy into Commodus as one pours wine into a cup, but the cup was cracked. The wine did not stay, it merely stained the floor. I must concede to Niccolo that words are weak against the gravity of instinct. You speak of the story of the axe, but a story is merely a sound in the air. It cannot replicate the callus on the hand. Consider the thought experiment of the painted fire. Imagine a man freezing in a winter cabin. On the wall, his father has hung a magnificent, lifelike painting of a roaring fire. The heir's dilemma. The son sits before the painting. It is beautiful. It depicts the heat perfectly. He praises the painter. He recites the history of the fire. But he freezes to death. Why? Because a representation of heat is not heat. The savage's advantage. Outside, a barbarian with no knowledge of art gathers dirty, wet sticks and strikes a rough flint. His fire is smoky and small, but it is real. He survives. The crucial distinction. Commodus possessed the painted fire of my meditations. He could quote the Stoics, but he never felt the cold that makes the fire necessary. Mr. Lincoln, your reverence is a painting of the fire. It warms the heart of those who remember the cold, but to the generation born in the summer, it is just decoration. This reveals a deeper principle of the hegemonicon. Truth must be digested to become virtue. Food on the plate does not nourish. Only food that is eaten and assimilated becomes blood and bone. My error was assuming that by placing the food of philosophy before my son, I could compel him to eat. But the appetite for virtue comes only from the starvation of the soul, which is to say, from suffering. Niccolo, you are right that the palace is a cradle of weakness, but you are wrong to think the wolf pit is the only school. The true teacher is self-examination. A man can suffer in a pit and become a beast, or he can suffer and become a king. The difference is not the suffering, but the logos, the reasoned choice to find meaning in the pain. I failed not because I was a philosopher, but because I could not make Commodus a philosopher of his own life.
This brings us to the paradox of the terminal peak. Marcus, your metaphor of the painted fire is a devastating critique of Lincoln's political religion. You argue that the image of virtue generates no heat, and that the appetite for virtue requires the starvation of the soul. This leads to a terrifying conclusion for any great leader. Your success is the architect of your successor's failure. By solving the crisis and filling the belly of the nation, the great leader removes the very starvation necessary to forge the next leader. The peak of the Golden Age is therefore always a cliff edge. Abraham, you tried to build a bridge across this cliff with reverence, but Marcus suggests that without the cold, the bridge collapses under the weight of human complacency. Niccolo, you observed this cyclical nature of history. Virtue builds empires, peace breeds idleness, idleness brings ruin. If the philosopher king is a biological accident that cannot be replicated, and if education is merely painting fire on a wall, are we forced to abandon the hope for moral leadership entirely? Niccolo Machiavelli, if we cannot rely on the virtue of the prince, must we instead rely on the conflict of the republic? Is the only solution to the Commodus problem to build a system that expects the leader to be wicked, a machine that runs on the fuel of human vice rather than the rare spark of virtue?
Moderator, you have finally abandoned the nursery for the foundry. You ask if we must build a machine that runs on the fuel of human vice. I answer with a decisive yes. To build a state on the hope of a good prince is to build a fortress on the edge of a volcano. You are safe only until the mountain clears its throat. Marcus, your tragedy confirms that hereditary monarchy is a game of Russian roulette played with the head of the state. You lament that the painted fire gave no heat. But I tell you, the solution is not to find real fire, but to build an engine that runs on ice. Consider the thought experiment of the yoked tigers. Imagine a heavy chariot that must be pulled across the world. The Stoic idealist approach, you search the world for two white horses of perfect temperament. You train them with whispers and apples. They pull gently. But one day, a horse dies, or a foal is born wild. The chariot stops. The Republican approach. I take two hungry tigers, ambition and fear. They hate each other. They want to tear each other apart. But I yoke them to a heavy pole in such a way that they cannot reach each other's throats. To escape their confinement, they must pull forward. The result? The chariot moves not because of the beast's virtue, but because of their struggle. This reveals the secret of the Roman Republic. It was not great because it was peaceful. It was great because it was tumultuous. The hatred between the Senate and the plebeians did not destroy liberty. It created the laws that protected it. Mr. Lincoln, your political religion relies on men being angels who remember the past. My republic of distrust relies on men being devils who want the future. We make the ambition of the consul check the ambition of the tribune. We do not try to remove the poison of self-interest. We dilute it against itself until it becomes medicine. The great leader is a biological accident. The great republic is an architectural engineering of human sin.
This brings us to the paradox of the soulless machine. Niccolo, you propose a brilliant solution. Structural engineering replaces moral education. You argue that if we harness the tigers of ambition correctly, we don't need the painted fire of virtue. This is the very logic of the American Constitution. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. However, Abraham, you presided over the moment when the yoke snapped. The American Republic was built exactly as Niccolo described, a system of checks and balances designed to contain the devils of faction. Yet, in 1861, the Tigers became so furious that they tore the chariot apart. The mechanics of compromise failed to solve the moral problem of slavery. This suggests a terrifying flaw in Niccolo's engine. A system built on self-interest cannot solve a problem that requires self-sacrifice. When the Tigers want different things that cannot be compromised, the yoke of the law shatters. Abraham Lincoln, does the Republic of Distrust inevitably fail when it faces a moral absolute? Must the yoked tigers eventually be tamed by a higher law? Or was the Civil War simply a mechanical failure of the yoke that could have been engineered better?
Moderator, you strike the nail on the head with the hammer of history. I answer that the Republic of Distrust failed because a machine can calculate interest, but it cannot weigh a soul. Niccolo, your yoked tigers worked admirably for tariffs and taxes, matters where half a loaf is better than no bread. But when the question became whether a Negro is a man or a chattel, the tigers could no longer pull together, for they were pulling in universes that could not coexist. You ask if the yoke was simply engineered poorly. I tell you, compromise is the mortar of politics, but you cannot build a foundation on a crack. The founders built a magnificent house, but they left the cancer of slavery in the basement, hoping it would die of starvation. Instead, it grew until it threatened to bring down the whole structure. Consider the thought experiment of the blind locomotive. Imagine a steam locomotive built with perfect mechanical precision. The pistons drive the wheels, and the pressure valves prevent explosion. The Machiavellian conductor. He obsesses over the grease and the steam pressure. He ensures the train runs efficiently. He does not care where it is going, only that it moves without derailing. The crisis. The tracks fork. The left track leads to a city of free labor. The right track leads to a precipice. The failure of the machine. The tigers just want to push. They have no eyes. If the track is set to the cliff, the machine will drive itself over the edge with perfect, efficient fury. The crucial distinction. A great leader cannot just be the mechanic who greases the axles. He must be the switchman. When the machine drives toward a moral abyss, the mechanics of self-interest will not save you, because it is often in a man's short-term interest to exploit another. This reveals the fatal flaw in your engine of ice, Niccolo. A system built only on self-interest acts like a cancer cell. It functions perfectly for its own growth while destroying the body that hosts it. The Civil War was not a failure of the Constitution's mechanics. It was a reckoning of its soul. We had to decide if the proposition that all men are created equal was a truth or a lie. A machine cannot answer that. Only a conscience can. Therefore, the higher law is not a religious intrusion. It is the geometric axiom without which the equation of the Republic collapses. If we admit that might makes right, then the slaveholder is justified. But if we believe right makes might, then we must eventually break the machine to reset the bone.
This brings us to the paradox of the necessary miracle. Abraham, you argue that the machine of interests is blind and requires a moral switchman to steer it away from the abyss. You contend that without this geometric axiom, the efficient engine efficiently destroys itself. Niccolo, however, would counter that relying on a switchman is a gamble on a miracle. If the survival of the state depends on a good man being at the switch when the tracks fork, the state is already doomed, for history rarely provides a Lincoln when one is needed. Marcus, you lived this paradox as the ultimate switchman. You guided the empire by the logos, yet you could not embed that logos into the structure of the empire itself. It died with you. Abraham's geometric axiom seems to be a modern incarnation of your universal reason, but he tried to write it into the public soul, whereas you largely kept it in your private diary. Marcus Aurelius, is the logos something that can truly be woven into the yoke of the tigers, or does it forever remain a lonely spark in the mind of the philosopher? Can a state truly possess a conscience, or is collective virtue a myth that eventually surrenders to the mechanics of interest?
Moderator, you ask if the Logos can be carved into the stone of the state, or if it remains a lonely spark. I answer that a state is a mask, and a mask has no eyes. It cannot see the light of reason. Only the man wearing it can see. To expect a system to possess a conscience is to mistake the chariot for the charioteer. Lincoln, your switchman is indeed a gamble on a miracle, but it is a gamble we cannot escape. You hope for a saint to stand at the lever. Niccolo hopes for a devil to be contained by the lever. But I tell you, the lever itself is cold iron. It does not care if it switches the train to the city or the cliff. Consider the thought experiment of the marble loom. Imagine a loom built of indestructible marble, designed by the wisest architects to weave a perfect pattern called justice. The Machiavellian weaver. He knows the thread is rough and knotted. He builds the loom with sharp steel gears to force the thread through. The cloth is woven, yes, but the thread is frayed, bloodied, and held together only by the tension of fear. It covers the nakedness of the state, but it scratches the skin. The idealist weaver. He tries to weave a pattern of equality, using thread that naturally curls into knots of self-interest. He blames the loom when the machine jams. He shouts at the marble, commanding it to straighten the thread. The Stoic reality. The loom does not change the nature of the thread. If the thread is rotten, the cloth will tear, no matter how perfect the machine. The crucial distinction. You cannot weave a golden age out of leaden souls. The Logos cannot be embedded in the loom. It must be dyed into the thread. This reveals the terrifying limit of politics. The law is a wall against the wind, but it cannot stop the wind from blowing. I wrote my meditations not to change Rome's laws, for I was the law, but to discipline my own soul, knowing that if the emperor is a beast, the empire becomes a cage. Niccolo, your engine of ice fails, because ice melts when the heat of passion rises. Abraham, your moral axiom fails, because axioms are forgotten when the belly is empty. The switchman is not a structural flaw. He is the human condition. We are condemned to rely on the virtue of individuals, because ultimately, institutions do not decide. Men do.
This brings us to the paradox of the alchemist's lead. Marcus, you argue that the quality of the state is strictly limited by the quality of the citizen, that leaden souls cannot be woven into a golden age, no matter how perfect the loom. Abraham, you rely on transformation, that the switchman can inspire the thread to become stronger through reverence and memory, effectively transmuting the lead into gold through moral leadership. Niccolo, however, you write from a darker, perhaps more constant conviction, that the thread is permanently rotten. You famously claimed that men are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, and covetous. You do not hope for the thread to change its nature. You assume its corruption is a fixed constant of the universe. Yet, you praise the Roman Republic as the height of human achievement. This creates a direct contradiction with Marcus's view. If the thread is always bad, and the loom cannot change the thread, how does any greatness ever emerge? Niccolo Machiavelli, Marcus claims a state of rotten thread inevitably tears the cloth. You claim the thread is always rotten. Does this mean every state is doomed? Or is there a specific weave that forces bad men to create a good outcome without ever needing them to become good men?
Moderator, you ask if the rotten thread of human nature condemns every state to ruin. I answer with a decisive no, Marcus. Your despair arises because you are trying to weave a tapestry of angels. But I tell you that the finest silk is spun from the saliva of a worm. You ask how bad men create a good outcome. I answer through the alchemy of necessity. You argue that the loom cannot change the thread. This is true. But a wise legislator does not try to change the thread. He ties it into a knot of terror so tight that the thread cannot unravel regardless of its desire to do so. The glory of the Roman Republic did not spring from the virtue of its citizens, but from the disunity between the Senate and the plebeians. The nobility wished to dominate. The people wished not to be dominated. From this clash of two selfish desires, liberty was born as a compromise. Consider the thought experiment of the vault of daggers. Imagine a stone vault where every stone is a man. The Stoic architect. He searches for stones that want to fly upward. He finds none, for the gravity of human nature is to fall downward. His vault never rises. The Machiavellian architect. He accepts that every stone wants to fall. He arranges them in an arch, where each stone, in its attempt to fall, pushes against its neighbor. The keystone. He places the law as the keystone. Now, the harder the stones push, the stronger the vault becomes. The crucial distinction. The stones have not changed their nature. They still want to fall. But the structure forces their vice to perform the function of virtue. If one stone tries to slip out to save itself, the crushing weight of the others disciplines it immediately. This reveals the secret of the weave. Good laws are the fruit of the agitation which you condemn. You want a harmony of the soul, Marcus, but a republic requires a dissonance of interests. We do not need the miller to love the baker. We need the miller to fear the magistrate more than he loves his greed. Abraham, your switchman is a noble fantasy, but a dangerous one. If you rely on a man's conscience to stop the train, you are betting the state on a coin toss. I prefer to build the tracks so that the train cannot turn toward the cliff without derailing itself and killing the driver. Men never do good unless necessity drives them to it. But when they are free to choose and can do just as they please, confusion and disorder become rampant. Therefore, the golden age is not made of gold, Marcus. It is made of lead that has been hammered into shape by the anvil of fear and the hammer of law.
This brings us to the paradox of the indifferent arch. Niccolo, your vault of daggers offers a brilliant mechanism for stability, but it suffers from amoral indifference. A perfectly engineered vault can protect a torture chamber just as efficiently as it protects a university, for the stones care only about gravity, not justice. Abraham, you faced the ultimate test of this vault when the dissonance Niccolo praises exploded into a civil war that threatened to destroy the very foundation of the state. To save the Republic, you were forced to suspend habeas corpus and jail dissidents, effectively stepping outside the Constitution to save the Constitution. This suggests a terrifying synthesis. The moral leader must sometimes become the Machiavellian tyrant to preserve the space for morality to exist. You argued that a house divided cannot stand, but to keep it standing, you had to use the iron of military force rather than the logos of persuasion. Abraham Lincoln, did you find that the law eventually became a suicide pact that you had to break? And does this admission confirm Niccolo's dark truth that necessity ultimately trumps legality?
Moderator, you touch the scar that aches most when the weather turns cold. I confess I suspended the writ of habeas corpus. I confess I silenced the agitators. But I reject the title of Machiavellian, for there is a chasm as wide as the Mississippi between the tyrant who breaks the law to seize power and the guardian who breaks the window to save the family from the fire. Niccolo, you argue that necessity trumps legality. I argue that necessity is the test of legality's purpose. You view the law as a tool for the prince. I view the law as the Ark of the Covenant. Sometimes, to save the ark from sinking in the flood, one must touch it with profane hands. Consider the thought experiment of the glass case. Imagine the Constitution is a priceless parchment stored inside a heavy glass case. The house catches fire. The legalist. He refuses to break the glass because property law forbids destruction. He stands watch while the fire melts the glass and burns the parchment to ash. He dies virtuous, but the treasure is lost. The Machiavellian. He smashes the glass, not to save the parchment, but to steal the gold frame. He uses the chaos of the fire to loot the house. The steward. He smashes the glass with a heavy heart, cutting his own hands in the process. He grabs the parchment and runs through the flames. The crucial distinction. The steward does not smash the glass because he despises it. He smashes it because the glass exists for the parchment, not the parchment for the glass. Once the fire is out, he builds a new case, stronger than before. This reveals the fatal flaw in your vault of daggers, Niccolo. A machine cannot know when to violate its own programming to save its purpose. If the vault is purely structural, it will crush the citizens to maintain its shape, even when the purpose of the shelter is gone. I did not make the law a suicide pact. I asked the terrible question, are all the laws but one to go unexecuted, and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated? To assert that the Constitution prevents its own preservation is to mistake the map for the territory. Marcus, you fear the poison of power. I tell you, the poison is not in the act of the sword, but in the thirst of the soul. If a man amputates a limb to save a life, he is a surgeon. If he does it because he enjoys the cutting, he is a monster. The act is the same. The conscience is the difference.
This brings us to the paradox of the surgical soul. Abraham, you argue that the intent distinguishes the surgeon from the butcher. You claim that one can perform a violent act, smashing the glass, suspending liberty, without becoming a monster, provided the conscience remains fixed on the preservation of the whole. Niccolo, you would likely retort that the conscience is a luxury. The only thing that matters is that the patient survives the surgery. If the surgeon saves the patient but loses his own soul, the state still wins. Marcus, you lived this paradox more visceral than any other. You were a philosopher who wished to live in the world of books and kindness, yet you were forced by necessity to spend your reign on the freezing Danube frontier, commanding legions to slaughter the Marcomanni. You constantly warned yourself not to be dyed in purple, not to be corrupted by the absolute power you held. Marcus Aurelius, is Abraham's steward a realistic ideal or a comforting lie? When the philosopher king is forced to pick up the sword, does the action inevitably corrupt the actor? Can a man truly govern a violent world without the purple dye eventually seeping into his soul?
Mr. Lincoln, your distinction between the surgeon and the butcher is vital, yet I fear you underestimate the permeability of the soul. One cannot handle charcoal without blackening the fingers, nor wield absolute power without the risk of the purple dye seeping into the mind. You argue that purpose protects the steward, but I contend that habit is a stronger force than reason. The man who breaks the law for the good eventually forgets where the law ends and his will begins. Consider the thought experiment of the poisoned mask. Imagine a king forced to wear a golden mask lined with a numbing toxin to address his people. The danger? At first, the mask burns the skin, reminding the wearer of its falseness. Over time, the face goes numb. The king thinks he is still acting for the people, but he can no longer feel the difference between a smile and a sneer, nor can he feel the tears of those he commands. The crucial distinction. The only safety lies in constant self-examination. If the crown ever ceases to feel heavy, Mr. Lincoln, it means the neck has grown too stiff to look up at the gods. Therefore, the steward is not a fixed state of grace, but a daily war against one's own comfort. Use the sword if you must, but never let the handle fit comfortably in your palm. The moment the violence feels natural, the steward has died, and the tyrant has been born.
This brings us to the paradox of the martyrdom of sin. Abraham, you believe purpose inoculates the soul against guilt, while Marcus, you believe discipline shields the soul from the corruption of power. Yet both of you seem anxious to preserve the leader's moral hygiene, treating the ruler's conscience as a treasure that must be guarded at all costs. Niccolo, writing from the fractured and violent Italy of the Renaissance, you suggested that a prince must learn how not to be good. This implies that the obsession with a clean soul might actually be a dereliction of duty. Perhaps the true steward is not the one who remains pure, but the one willing to get his hands hopelessly dirty so the citizens can remain clean. Niccolo Machiavelli, is the ultimate sacrifice of leadership not death, but damnation, the willingness to destroy one's own moral innocence so that the state may survive.
Moderator, you have struck the very nerve of the matter. I answer with a decisive warning. The man who kills for his conscience is infinitely more dangerous than the man who kills for his crown. Consider the thought experiment of the plague ship. A vessel arrives at the harbor carrying the Black Death, but its deck is crowded with innocent women and children pleading for sanctuary. The moral man, he hesitates, paralyzed by the sin of murdering innocents, and in his hesitation the rats swim ashore and the entire city perishes. The prince, he orders the batteries to fire, sinking the ship and drowning the innocents to save the city. He accepts that he is a monster in the eyes of God, so that his people may live. Marcus, your poisoned mask is a luxury. The true prince drinks the poison willingly, damning his own soul so that his citizens may remain innocent. This is why a philosopher can never truly king. He loves his own virtue more than he loves the city.
This brings us to the paradox of the weeping executioner. Niccolo, you argue that the great leader must be willing to accept damnation, to sink the plague ship, and be hated by God to save the city. You accuse the moral leader of a sophisticated form of selfishness, prioritizing his own spiritual hygiene over the lives of his people. Marcus, you fear that once a leader accepts damnation as a tool, he becomes a beast who can no longer distinguish between saving the city and saving his own power. You argue that the soul is the compass, and without it, the ship is lost anyway. Abraham, you stood on the deck of that plague ship. You ordered the sinking of the Confederacy, knowing it meant the death of 600,000 brothers and sons. You suspended the Constitution to save it. You bore the title of tyrant from half the country. Abraham Lincoln, do you accept Niccolo's charge? Did you have to love the Union more than your own soul, effectively accepting moral ruin? Or is there a way to wield the sword of necessity without becoming the monster Niccolo admires?
Niccolo, you mistake agony for corruption. I did not love the Union more than my soul, but rather understood that my soul was the fuel required to keep the engine of the Union running. You argue that sinking the plague ship makes the captain a monster, but I contend that the sin lies in the enjoyment of the act, not the necessity of it. The leader who destroys the innocent with a smile is a devil, but the leader who does so with a breaking heart is a man of sorrows, bearing the weight of the tragedy so his people need not. Consider the thought experiment of the burning brand. Imagine a patient with a gangrenous limb that must be cauterized with a red-hot iron to survive. The butcher presses the iron down and enjoys the scream, reveling in his power over flesh. The hesitant saint refuses to inflict such terrible pain to save a life, preserving his moral purity while the patient dies of infection. The steward holds the iron with a shaking hand, feeling the phantom pain in his own flesh, yet presses it down because he values the life of the patient more than his own comfort. This is not damnation, Niccolo. It is sacrificial service. I did not lose my soul in the Civil War. I harrowed it, plowing the fields of my conscience with the sharp blades of war, so that liberty might grow in the furrows. The purple dye Marcus fears is only permanent if we stop washing our hands with the tears of our responsibility.
This brings us to the paradox of the calloused heart. Abraham, you propose agony as antidote, arguing that the leader's soul is preserved by the very pain of the necessary evil. You claim the shaking hand proves the surgeon is not a butcher. However, Marcus, your Stoic philosophy teaches the virtue of apatheia. You warned that being overwhelmed by emotion, even noble sorrow, can cloud the reason required to govern. Here lies a profound divergence. Abraham embraces the passion of guilt to stay human, while Marcus seeks the fortress of reason to stay sane. Abraham, if the surgeon weeps with every cut, does his hand not eventually shake too much to save the patient? Marcus, you ruled for 19 years, far longer than Abraham's 4. Did you find that harrowing the soul was a sustainable path, or did you survive only by detaching yourself from the tragedy? Marcus Aurelius, is Abraham's man of sorrows a recipe for madness in a long reign? Must the philosopher king eventually trade his agony for armor to survive the weight of the crown?
Mr. Lincoln, I honor your tears, but I must warn you. A hand that shakes from sorrow is no steadier than a hand that shakes from fear. You speak of agony as a check on power, but I tell you that uncontrolled emotion is a mist that obscures the logos. If the pilot of the ship weeps for the storm, he cannot read the stars. You ruled for 4 years of crisis. I ruled for 19 years of attrition. To rely on agony for 2 decades is to court madness or death. You might object that without this sorrow, the leader becomes Nicolo's cold stone. But I distinguish between sympathy and rational benevolence. Consider the thought experiment of the surgeon father. Imagine a master surgeon whose own child requires a life-saving operation. The loving father, he is overwhelmed by the pain of his child. His hand trembles with grief. Because he feels too much, he cannot cut precisely. He loves the child, but his agony endangers the life. The Stoic physician, he loves the child no less, but he builds an iron wall around his heart for the duration of the surgery. He suppresses the father so the surgeon can work. His hand is steady because his mind is still. The question, who truly serves the child, the one who weeps or the one who cuts true? This reveals the necessity of the inner citadel. The armor of reason is not worn to protect the king from pain, but to protect the judgment upon which the empire depends. If my reason collapses under the weight of the dead, I can no longer protect the living. Therefore, the philosopher king must retreat into his own soul, not to hide, but to recharge the rational will that governs his actions. To be a man of sorrows is a noble martyrdom, but a king must be a rock against which the waves break, standing firm and taming the fury around him, not drowning in it.
This brings us to the paradox of the invisible actor. Marcus, you advocate for the inner citadel, a disconnection of the inner self from the outer storm to maintain function. Abraham, you advocate for authentic agony, a total connection of the inner self to the outer tragedy to maintain humanity. Yet both of you share a hidden assumption, that the leader's internal reality matters to the state. Niccolo, you famously argued that the prince need not have all the virtues, but he must appear to have them. This suggests that leadership is neither about agony nor apotheia, but about performance. If the crowd believes the king is a rock, does it matter if he is trembling inside? If the crowd believes the president is a man of sorrows, does it matter if his heart is actually cold? Niccolo Machiavelli, is the debate between Abraham's heart and Marcus's reason merely a private vanity? Is the great leader simply the one who can feign whichever state the moment requires, the surgeon's tears or the stoic's calm, without actually being burdened by either?
Moderator, you have finally pierced the veil of sentimentality to reveal the cold iron of statecraft. I answer that authenticity is the vanity of the amateur. You ask if the hollow actor is a hypocrite. I tell you he is the only one who truly understands the nature of the vulgus. Men judge generally by the eye rather than by the hand, for everyone can see, but few can feel. You worry that acting corrupts the soul, but I argue that the prince's soul is irrelevant to the state. Only his mask matters. Consider the thought experiment of the painted corpse. Imagine a beloved general who dies of a heart attack the night before the decisive battle that will save the republic. The honest man, he announces his death to the troops. The soldiers, stricken with grief and fear, lose their morale and are slaughtered. The republic falls. The prince, he props the general's corpse upon his horse, ties his hands to the reins, and paints open his eyes. The troops see their leader alive and fearless. Inspired by the image, they fight with the fury of lions and win the war. The verdict, the truth of the general's death would have destroyed the state. The lie of his life saved it. Does it matter to the surviving citizens that the general was a corpse? No. The appearance of virtue achieved what the reality of death could not. Mr. Lincoln, your authentic agony is dangerous because it assumes the people want a human leader. They do not. They want a demigod. If you weep, do so because the script requires tears to move the crowd, not because you are sad. If you are truly sad, your hand may hesitate at the critical moment. Marcus, your stoic fortress is merely a private luxury. If the crowd needs a raging avenger, and you offer them a calm philosopher, you fail. The great leader is water, taking the shape of whatever vessel, tyrant, father, saint, or beast, the moment requires. He who remains true to himself is a slave to his own nature. He who feigns is the master of fortuna.
This brings us to the paradox of the rotting mask. Niccolo, you argue for the hollow actor, claiming that the painted corpse saves the state because the people react to the image, not the reality. However, Abraham, you famously warned that you can fool all the people some of the time, and some of the people all the time, but you cannot fool all the people all the time. This suggests a fatal flaw in Niccolo's painted corpse. Deception has a decay rate. The corpse eventually begins to smell. The paint cracks. The hollow actor, lacking an inner compass, eventually forgets which role he is playing, or worse, uses the mask solely for personal gain, because there is no inner citadel or conscience to check his ambition. Here lies a potential synthesis. Perhaps authenticity is not a moral luxury, but a structural necessity. The mask is needed to capture power, but the soul is needed to sustain it. A mask with no face behind it eventually collapses under the weight of the crown. Abraham Lincoln, you were a master politician who used humor, silence, and timing. You were made in the fires of politics, yet you were known as Honest Abe. Was your honesty a calculated performance to win trust, or was it the iron skeleton that prevented your administration from rotting from within?
Niccolo, your painted corpse is a ghastly masterpiece of short-term gain, but it ignores the tyranny of time. You argue that the image is enough to win the battle, and perhaps it is for one afternoon. But a war is not a single afternoon, and a republic is not a theater stage where the curtain falls and the actors go home. I answer that honesty is not a Sunday school virtue. It is the reinforced concrete of the state. You ask if Honest Abe was a performance? I tell you, it was a strategic necessity. In a democracy, the leader has no army but the people's will. If I issue a promissory note, a call for 75,000 volunteers, and the people believe the bank of my word is empty, no one marches. The mask you prize is a liability because it requires infinite maintenance. The truth, how hard, stands on its own legs. Consider the thought experiment of the hollow pillar. An architect is tasked with building a bridge across a raging river to carry a heavy train. The Machiavellian architect. To save money and appear efficient, he builds pillars of hollow wood, but paints them to look like solid marble. The crowd cheers the beautiful bridge. It looks strong. The honest builder. He builds with rough, unpolished granite. It looks ugly and cost 3 times as much. The crowd grumbles at the expense. The test. When the train rolls onto the bridge, the image of the marble is irrelevant to the laws of physics. The hollow wood snaps, and the train plunges into the abyss. Gravity, like the people's ultimate judgment, cannot be charmed by paint. This reveals that credibility is a finite resource. If I had used your painted corpse strategy to hide the defeats at Bull Run, the people would have eventually discovered the lie. Once discovered, they would not have believed me when I told them of the victory at Antietam. A leader who lies to save the state eventually finds that his lies have become the state's currency, and inflation soon makes it worthless. Marcus, you retreat to your citadel to preserve your reason, but I argue that the leader must live in the marketplace of trust. The rotting mask does not just smell, it infects the citizens. If the head is false, the body loses its coordination. I did not tell the truth because I was a saint. I told it because I needed the people to carry the burden with me, and men will not carry a heavy load for a man they suspect is picking their pockets.
Mr. Lincoln, Your hollow pillar assumes the burden is static. But in war, the burden is terror, and the only strut that holds it back is often a well-placed lie. I answer that credibility is not born of truth, but of success. The people do not care if the medicine was snake oil, provided the patient recovers. Consider the siege of the empty granary. The honest steward reveals the food is gone, sparking a riot that burns the city to the ground before the enemy even breaches the walls. The prince lies that the bins are full, rationing secretly, and this false hope keeps order just enough for the relief ships to arrive. The decay of the mask you fear is irrelevant if the crisis is solved before the paint cracks. You did not save the Union with the truth of the Constitution, which you broke, but with the myth of destiny that justified the breaking.
Niccolo, your empty granary is a solution that works exactly once, like burning your furniture to heat the house. You survive the night, but you have destroyed the home you sought to protect. You assume that the lie is a tool the prince puts down, but I tell you it is a blindfold that he ties onto his own citizens. If you blind your soldiers to keep them calm, how can you expect them to fight effectively when the enemy, who sees clearly, attacks? Consider the thought experiment of the broken compass. A ship is lost in a violent storm, and the magnetic compass shatters. The Machiavellian captain, fearing mutiny, he paints a fake needle on the glass, pointing north, and shouts that he knows the way. The crew, comforted by the lie, rows with great energy, but they row in the wrong direction, driving the ship onto the rocks with full force. The Stoic navigator, he holds up the broken compass and says, "The instrument is dead. We must now navigate by the stars and the fury of the wind." The crew is terrified, yes, but their fear makes them alert to the reality of the waves. The verdict: the lie creates false order, which leads to real death. The truth creates temporary chaos, which allows for rational survival. This reveals that reality is the only ally of the state. Mr. Lincoln, you are correct to reject the painted corpse. A leader who relies on the noble lie eventually finds himself warring against nature herself, for he is trying to force the world to fit his deception. To govern by lies is to sever the logos, the rational connection between the head and the hands. When the head lies, the hands eventually strangle the body.
I have heard all of your closing remarks, debating whether the painted corpse of deception or the rough granite of truth ultimately upholds the state. You have illuminated that while the performance of power may survive the immediate crisis, only the alignment with reality, anchored in the people's trust or the leader's reason, can endure the relentless erosion of time. Thank you, Niccolo, Marcus, and Abraham, for this timeless dissection of the heavy price of leadership. This concludes today's discourse.